G'day mates, it's Busta here, and before the episode begins, I would like to give Stitch Fix a big shout out for sponsoring this video. So, when it comes to shopping for clothes, I think most of us are pretty much amateurs. Well, I know I am at least. So, why not let a professional do it for you? And with Stitch Fix, a stylist can do just that. Stitch Fix is an online personal styling service that delivers your favorite clothing, shoes, and accessories directly to you. They have brands that you know and love, plus exclusive styles that you won't find elsewhere. After completing your style profile, your expert personal stylist will send you a hand-picked box of items based on your style and preferences. With Stitch Fix, everyone can look their best. They have solutions for women, men, and kids all over the US, and now the UK as well. With no subscription required, pick between automatic shipments or only getting new pieces on demand. Shipping, exchanges, and returns are always free, and plus, the $20 styling fee is automatically applied towards anything you keep from your box. I actually ordered some items through them previously, and I must say that they really chose well for me, and I was really happy with what I received. So, get started today at stitchfix.com/scared and get an extra 25% off when you keep everything in your box. That's stitchfix.com/scared. stitchfix.com/scared. For some backstory, I'm female, 18 now. I was 13 when this encounter occurred though. This might be kind of long, but bear with me. I promise that it's a good one. So this encounter happened around 2013 and I was part of this girls only group. We met up every week and just hung out and do teenage things. There were different locations around my city and I obviously went to one closest to me. It was about a 10-minute drive from my house, and the building where we met was a massive local park near a lake, which made for plenty of fun times. The group was for girls aged 13 to 17, so we generally all got along pretty well. The particular group that I was in met on Thursday nights, and there was 9 of us. 2 are my family friends, who were also my lifelong best friends. Them and 2 other girls, and I went to the same school. So, there was this camp every year, and the goal was to do everything yourself. We had to set up our own campsite, make all of our dinners, all that sort of stuff, and to be quite honest, it was pretty fun. I'd been 2 times previously, and it's a bit of a competition, and our group split into 2. Me, Erin, Izzy, and Jess. The other 5 girls were in another group, and one thing that we do to prepare was to go shopping for food, so we did that one night and spent the other few nights packing everything that we would need, like tents and portable stove, stuff for a fire, etc. My friend Erin and I were in the same class at school, so the Friday afternoon of the camp we left early and her mum picked us up. We live in the same street, so we got our things and carpooled there with the other girls, Izzy and Jess. The park where all the camps were was pretty massive, and we stopped for pizza along the way. The first few nights of the camp went pretty well, and we stayed up all night eating candy in our tent, sneaking out and walking around the massive park, talking, playing Truth or Dare and Never Have I Ever, and, normal teenage girl things. On the last full day, we did an activity that we chose prior to going to the camp. Out of all the girls in my group, I was the only one who had chosen to do archery, and I only knew 2 other girls from my main group, and I got to know some of the other girls I didn't know from the other groups. But during the activity, the leaders just started acting really weird. They were looking at each other, whispering, and talking on their walkie-talkies. The girls that I knew from our group back at home, who weren't in my group at the camp, were doing archery too, so I hung around with them, and we were discussing why we thought the leaders were acting so weird. The leaders seemed to get more scared every minute, and they called us all over and told us to go into one of the buildings because we were going into lockdown. I stuck with the girls, and some other activity groups went inside. Everyone else from the other activity groups went to the building on the other side of the park, though, including the girls from my group at this camp. We hung out there chatting to everyone for maybe an hour, I'd guess, and we all talked about the camp so far and then about what we thought was going on. And this one girl called Chloe said that a girl had seen a naked man with a knife walking around in the woods. And another girl named Monique said that there was a gang in the woods who knew of this girls' camp and wanted to find someone to snatch. Obviously, we were all freaked out either way. Then, they offered us bathroom breaks, and we went in groups of 4 outside to the bathrooms, and 2 leaders escorted us at all times. There were also 2 cop cars outside, and when I saw them, I felt really uneasy. We started to talk amongst ourselves, but the leaders led us to the bathrooms and told us to shush. When we got into the bathroom, they explained everything. So apparently, a girl in the orienteering group, her name was Pippa, had spotted a naked man holding a knife. So Chloe was actually correct about this. They told us that it was all going to be okay and that the cops were searching for him. They called everyone's parents and the police finished their search, and when this was done, one of the cops came into our building and said that they'd got the guy and we were all safe now. We were let back to our campsites, and when I saw my friends from the other building back at the tent, I hugged them and they asked if I was okay, and I asked them the same. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but the girl who saw the man, Pippa, went home and was obviously pretty traumatized. We were supposed to cook our own dinners that night on the fire, but to celebrate, the leaders ordered a crapload of pizza and soda and fries for us to have a massive feast at. We were all pretty scared that night, and we didn't sneak out of our tent like we had the other nights, even though the guy had been arrested, and we were all still pretty creeped out. The next year, there was this girl in my class named Hannah. I found out that she was a part of the same girls' club that I was, but from another location in my city. I slightly recognized her after she told me this, and I brought up the incident at the camp from the previous year, and she was actually at the camp too. She was part of that orienteering group that saw the guy, and she told me that he indeed was naked and had a knife. I'm guessing that he was probably on something, but still, it was a creepy night. I come from a military family, and as such, I've lived all over the country, often unable to keep friends for any period. I also have insane social anxiety, so I'm overall pretty bad at making friends to start with. This story starts after I lived in rural Newfoundland for about 3 years at age 14. I have no friends, my home life is pretty terrible, and I was at this point pretty depressed. I lived on about an acre of land with a river separating us from about 1 million acres of raw forest. I have no idea the size or how big it was. That had a bunch of ATV trails in it. It was a pretty spooky forest, and I have a ton of stories from in there. Of note is the bear trap forest, the 40-foot swamp, the random abandoned suburb, and the house in the middle of nowhere. But those are stories for another time. So, it was around late August. My parents had told me that for many weeks now, there had been hoots and hollers coming from our backyard. They had seen flashlights and thought it was some kids just trying to break into our garage and steal some beer or something. There had been some times when I heard it too, normally in the evening, just a couple of voices periodically hollering, and often I heard several voices speaking from just across the river in the woods. It was no big deal. A lot of kids hung out in those woods, and due to my oppressive social anxiety, I sure didn't have any desire to talk to them. After this had happened, for some weeks, I had heard the kids doing their usual thing around 4 in the afternoon and decided, screw it, I'm going to see what's so amusing. So I venture into the woods and go maybe about 300 feet in an ATV trail my neighbor used, and I met one of them. I'm going to use their names too, as maybe it will give some context to someone out there. So, the kid that I met was named Jack. He was a year or 2 younger than me, about a foot shorter I'd say, and wearing some really out-of-date clothes. He seemed kind of surprised to meet me, in fact, but we said our hellos, and I said that I had heard them for a while now and came to see what was happening. Jack got super pumped and insisted that I follow him to his friend's project. So I follow the guy, and I'm brought into an area that's pretty clear-cut in a dense part of the woods. I knew this area, and I hung out in these woods alone a lot and explored, but a lot of this stuff that I was seeing was brand new. There were 2 other kids there, one my age named Elvis, and an older kid by about 2 years named Lewis. They said that they were working on a treehouse or a fort and wondered if I was interested in helping. I, of course, said yes, as I'd never really been asked to ever hang out with anyone before, and they showed me around. Now, I need to discuss these kids' clothes because it was weird. When I say out of style, I'm talking early 80s miserable fashion style. Neon colors, and one kid had shoulder pads. It was honestly just a mess. Plus, they wore big rubber boots, and the kids looked, I want to say new, but like they had no signs of pimples. Their hair was immaculate, and their clothes were crisp as hell, and I just assumed that they had hand-me-downs from their parents or something. By the way, too, they stated that they were all friends and not brothers. So, these kids were nice to me, and I mean really nice. I never really got to know them, though. I mean, they never wanted to talk about their home life or anything. But I guess that's not too surprising as to where I lived and all that. But we used hatchets, saws, ropes, and nails to make a pretty solid fort. It had about 8-foot walls made of birch trees. We made a table to sit at, a lookout post in the biggest tree that we could find. The place was about the size of a one-bedroom apartment, I'd say, and we were all around pretty proud of it. One day, we were sitting at the table talking about our favorite trees or something, and I asked Elvis why I'd never seen him around before. I mean, if he lived near me, he had to go to my school. It was one of 2 schools in my town, and there was no way that he lived in the catchment area of the other one. He insisted that he did, though, and wondered why we'd never met either. We didn't know the same classmates, same people, could barely agree on teachers, but whatever, I guess. These kids talked to me, and that was enough. So, about 2 weeks after meeting them and building this fort, I said that I needed to go home and get something to eat. I asked if they wanted something too, as this was basically my backyard, and my parents always made too much food anyway, and they became downright hostile. Not over the food, mind you, they just refused to cross the river. Adamantly, Lewis came up with a story about how crossing a stranger's river is bad luck. But I wasn't going to push the issue, so I asked if they wanted something, and they said yes, and I brought back a pie that we could all eat. They apologized about getting angry, said that they were just very superstitious, and honestly, I didn't think more of it. We had a good rest of the day, just planning to invade the woods and looking for thick pine trees and whatnot. But cut to about a week later, and I'd went to the fort and we did our thing. But today, the kids looked haggard, if that's the right word. Jack was particularly bad too. He looked like he had just gotten the beatdown of his life while catching pneumonia 3 times over or something. I asked if he was okay, and he said yeah, it was just the flu, but they all also looked really wet. Maybe greasy is a better word, but they had sick hair, and their skin was all shiny and clammy, and their clothes just looked terrible. I wasn't shocked. I mean, these kids wore the same clothes every day, but so did a lot of the really poor kids in town, and they never looked like that. Well, we played around for an hour or so before they left, with Lewis saying that he'll see me tomorrow as Jack and Elvis walked away coughing like they smoked a pack a day. I told my parents about these kids, and they thought that the kids were weird, but a kid with no friends just found 3. Don't ask questions, right? By the way, too, the nighttime hollering had stopped at this point, and we never did see the flashlights again after this. So the next day I went back with a hatchet and a bag of nails in hand, as the plan was that we were going to give the roof a new lookout. And when I came to the fort, the place was just wrecked. The walls had been torn down, the table was in half, and the lookout had maybe 1 or 2 pieces left to it. Most notably, too, was that everything, and I mean everything, was rotting. Like, it had been sitting there for decades. The table was basically nothing, and I could see growth in what had to have been our floor, and it was a solid half-tree growth. My only thought at the time, too, was, what the hell? And I rationalized that maybe someone found our fort and wrecked it or something. And so I just waited for the kids to come. And the next day, and the next day, and the day after that, and I waited a week, and I never did see those kids again. I was pretty dejected, and eventually I stopped trying to wait for them. I wanted to look for them, but they had never shown me or told me where they lived, other than up the hill. My parents noticed too, and asked why I wasn't hanging out with the kids anymore, and I told them what was happening. They dismissed it and just insisted that if they didn't want to be my friend, I didn't need them anyway, and I was sad for a good while after that, but eventually I got over it. Cut to today though, and I'm 29, and I'm telling my wife about these kids that I used to hang out with and the time that we made a cool fort. I explain how they look, how they acted. It's overall a pretty good memory with a sad ending, but my wife looks at me wide-eyed and just says, "You hung out with a bunch of spooky ghost kids." I find this crazy, but she says, "Did anyone else see them?" And I have to admit that no, they didn't. They saw a flashlight, but not the kids. They heard them and heard about them, but no one laid eyes on them other than me. There were never any records that I could find about them too. No one else in the school that they supposedly went to knew them, and they never showed me their house or came to mine, despite my insistence, and my wife said that was some pretty spooky stuff and I should share it with you guys. And so, here I am. So I shared a story the other day about some weird kids in the woods. It went over pretty well, so I thought that I would share another story that happened to me. So just to remind you, I have these big woods behind my house, and I lived at Newfoundland. It was just the wild, untapped wilderness for as far as the eyes could see, and even way beyond that. Throughout these woods were a series of ATV trails that winded pretty far in, as people would often just go for a day into the woods, use them to have bush parties or go moose hunting and all that sort of stuff. But about 15 or so kilometers in, down one specific path, is a raised patch of gravel. No one is sure why it's there, but it was visited about once a month by people often looking to have a party. Me, being a teenager with almost no friends, the woods were basically the only friend that I had. I knew these woods well, knew where all the weird places in them were, knew the trails to go down, and knew when something had changed too. I went in them just about every day, and often just walked for hours listening to music or just enjoying the dull hum of nature. So one day, I was going for a longer walk than normal, about 12 hours, and decided that I wanted to go back up to that gravel patch. It had a decent view of the valley, and I knew a few nice places near there that I could just rest and enjoy the scenery. It was a nice enough day with the sun out and summer in full swing, so I left first thing in the morning and walked. The way there was uneventful, and the woods were as they always were, and I didn't think much more of it. It was about a 6-hour walk to the patch given the terrain, but I honestly didn't mind. I need to emphasize too that nothing was abnormal this whole trip up to the gravel patch. I had some water with me, some snacks, I wore a hat because I sunburned by thinking about the sun too much, sunscreen and proper clothes, and I didn't see another person on this trail, which is expected given where I was going. So, about 6 hours later, I get to the gravel patch at around 4 p.m. The patch is about 300 feet across, I'd say, and it creates what basically is a man-made cliff looking over a valley. Smack in the middle of this patch is a house, an old-style box house that a lot of people in Newfoundland used to have. A small little 2-story place with a roof that was almost flat, coloured a bright pastel yellow. I need to make clear too that no one ever builds these anymore. They kind of suck to live in by all accounts, and the last batch was built maybe in the 70s, I'd say. But here was this new-looking box house on this gravel patch, with new windows and everything. Also, the path to get there could be generously described as a goat path, I suppose, with enough space for an ATV to pass through if you don't mind getting whapped by some trees. There is just no way that anyone would undertake this task to build a house up here. But, needless to say, I was really confused when I saw this thing. I circle around the house from a fairly wide berth and notice that a door on the other side is wide open. So, being the intrepid wilderness explorer and idiot that I was, I decided that I'd go in. It led directly into the kitchen, and the place just seemed wrong. The room, and really the whole house, I suppose, was decorated as if it came straight out of the 50s. pastel-coloured everything, a little table with a yellow-flowered tablecloth, an old-timey wood stove, ancient kettle, everything. The place looked lived in too, and pretty new. The floor was spotless, and the only dirty thing was in the sink, a plate or something, and I was drawn to the stove, and for some reason, really liked the kettle too. I picked it up briefly to look at it, and to my shock, it was actually warm. As in, it felt like it had recently been boiling, maybe 5 minutes ago. I gently place it back down, mouth quietly under my breath, what the hell, and move on exploring. Now, the kitchen led to a small hall with what I presume was a living room at the end and a staircase in the middle to go to the second floor. I could see in the living room a large wooden coffee table, an old-style paisley couch, and a rabbit-eared tube TV in the corner. But for some reason, I was immediately drawn upstairs, so rather than explore the living room, I went that way instead. The staircase was pretty long, well over 30 steps, but I did eventually get to the top with a tense feeling. By this point, I had taken out my music and was kind of listening for any other sounds. The house was dead silent, though, only broken by my creaking of the floorboards. I don't know what I was expecting, but the place did look lived in. I wasn't going to call out or anything for someone, as I had a hard enough time believing that this house was even here. At the top, though, it was just a wall. To my right were 2 doors spaced fairly far apart, in a parallel hall to the staircase, and to my left were 2 doors really close together with barely a hall, more of a landing, I suppose, parallel to the staircase. All of the doors were closed, and I was in hypervigilance mode, but I decided to take the right and go through the first door. Inside the room were dozens of old creepy Victorian dolls in what I assumed to be a little girl's room. There was a small bed and pink walls, tiny half-size vanity. Thankfully the dolls weren't staring at me, as dolls just kind of creep me out, even on a good day. In the small room there was no little girl in sight, but again, the place just looked eerily clean. The bed was made, the floors were kept, everything was in its place. I noticed an old-style hand mirror on the dresser, probably one of those plastic things that you get little kids, and said out loud, why not, thinking that I would take a peek at it. And not 1 second later, I heard at the door on the other side of the landing, giggling. It was one of those old brass and crystal handles, a fact that I accurately remember. And quite honestly, I had never been so scared in my life as I whipped around to see the door become slightly ajar and the clear presence of another person on the other side. It didn't feel good. I mean, the place had felt just kind of hostile since I walked in it, and I felt it rank up to 11 at this point. As quick as I could move, I dashed into the hallway and leapt down the stairs. Lacking the grace of a man that could jump a floor and be fine, I crashed into the wall, leaving a decent-sized man-shaped hole in what I guess was drywall. I bolted out of the kitchen door as quick as I could, muttering nope over and over again as I began to book it from the house. I did do a quick look behind me to confirm what had happened, and yes, there was a house, and yes, I did see someone coming down the stairs. It only took one glance, but I made it into the woods and down the goat path, and eventually I just went home. I didn't care that it was probably going to take me a while, and there may or may not be someone chasing me who may or may not have a gun. I just needed to get out, now. The adrenaline lasted about an hour after I made my way back home, and after that I became immediately jumpy at almost anything and walked the rest of the way home in silence. When I arrived home, my parents weren't there, but I wasn't having any of it. I just went into bed and went to sleep as quick as I could. The rest of the summer went by without incident, and towards the end of it, I told myself that I was going to go back to that gravel pit and go look at the house again. Maybe even apologize if I scared the hell out of someone in a house that I barely believed existed. But when I went back there was no sign of a house anywhere. No indentations in the ground, no wayward piece of wood, nothing. Just some old beer cans from a party that someone probably had here not too long ago. Thoroughly confused and mildly scared now, I just decided to leave that area well enough alone. When school started up, I told my classmates all about it, but they thought it was just something that I made up, possibly due to heat exhaustion or something. But I know what I saw, and it was a freaky house. Now, one of my classmates, a kid named Randy, said that he was going to go up there to try to find this place if it was there over the weekend. I told him to go ahead, but I'm not going there just in case. Randy reported back on Monday that, yes, he did see the house, the same as I described it, box-style, painted pastel yellow with the kitchen door open. But when I asked if he went inside, I believe that his response was, not for $1 million. Inquiring as to why, Randy stated that when he went there in a second-floor window, he saw a little girl, and he said that she was maybe 5 or 6. The location fit up with my understanding where the little girl's room would be, and he said that she was just shaking her head, looking straight at him wide-eyed. Randy was a pretty good guy, and he was actually worried that this kid was in this abandoned house with no one to look after her, so he went to the door to get in. But when he looked inside, he saw a figure standing in the living room area, and at this point, he just got out of there as quick as he could. Stated that the energy was mad and that he had no intention of getting it madder. He didn't look back and he didn't care to, he told me. A few other people went up to the gravel pit to see if they could find the house after that, but no one had any success. They said that it was just a gravel pit and I was being a jittery idiot. Randy even backpedaled and said that he made it up for me to get scared, but I know fear in someone's eyes when I see it. Randy, he was legitimately scared, and to be honest, I can't blame him. I went back up that way a few more times after that when I lived in Newfoundland. Never did see the house again. It's just one of those things that I can't understand, and it still haunts me to this day when I think about it. That feeling was just so mad. It's the only way I can describe it, and I haven't felt visceral anger like it since. And frankly, nothing has even come close to it. I've lived and seen dozens of other spooky events, but this one was by far the one that was the most hostile feeling. I can safely say that I hope I never see that place again. A few years ago, I moved with my family right before I started college. Unfortunately, it was kind of far from the university that I'd been accepted into, so I'd been trying to find a place to rent close to my university. My dad helped me and showed me an ad on Craigslist. There was a nice-looking house for rent, and it was close to my university, so I decided to set up a meeting to go and check out the place. I showed up in the afternoon, and unfortunately, I was alone. My dad said that I was an adult and a big guy, so I shouldn't worry about meeting this person. This old guy greeted me and then goes, "You'll have to follow me to get to the house for rent." I was confused by this and said, "Your ad said that this was the house for rent. Why do I have to go somewhere else?" He says, "This is my house, I'll take you to the one that's for rent." I'm a little concerned at this point, but I followed him to his other place anyway. I figured that if things didn't look right, that I would just leave, but we get there and I noticed that the house looks bad and it looked like people were in it too. I didn't see any cars around though, so this seemed really odd. He looks at me and says, "Don't you want to check it out?" And I said, "I don't know, this isn't what was in your ad and it looks like other people are there," and he tells me that the other people are checking it out and I could join them. But something just felt weird about the whole thing, and I told him that I just wasn't interested anymore. This place looked in bad shape from the outside and appeared to have people in the house. When he asked why I wasn't interested, I told him it was too far of a drive to school and work, and he got really mad at me and accused me of wasting his time. I said, "I'm not the one advertising a house and then telling the person that it's not the one for rent." And he began to glance nervously towards the house and asked if I wasn't sure that I didn't want to check it out. I told him no at this point, and then I just left. And he never contacted me again, thankfully. I'm not sure what his intentions were, but something about the whole situation just felt really wrong. Maybe he was just trying to show me the house, but I didn't like that he lied about the house to begin with and that there were people inside the other house. I'm not sure what's going on there, but I didn't really want to find out either. I also didn't like how he kept looking at the house when he was asking if I was sure that I didn't want to check it out. It seemed really bizarre how he went from being mad at me to getting kind of desperate for me to go inside. Back in January of 1995, when driving home on leave, I experienced something just straight out of a movie. I was getting ready to be deployed to Gitmo for a joint task force mission and needed my parents to take care of 2 kittens that I had adopted a few months earlier. The drive home would usually take around 6 to 7 hours, but I didn't mind the drive. Anyone who's ever driven through Texas knows that you can drive for quite a while and not see another car on the road. So it's about 9 p.m. and I'm about 15 minutes outside of Seymour, Texas, heading towards Dallas. The 2 cats, for the most part, had taken up residence on my back section by the rear window and had been sleeping. And it was here that things started to get strange. So I noticed about 200 plus meters behind me another vehicle's headlights, and I don't think anything of it. A few moments later, the cats both started making this moaning noise over and over again, and I figured they needed to go to the restroom, so I pulled over. So I'm in the middle of nowhere with these 2 cats freezing because it's January, waiting for them to do their business. After about 5 minutes and a cigarette, I decided to put them back in the car and gave them a little bit of dry food. I began heading back down the road, and so 10 minutes go by, and I see headlights again behind me, possibly a little closer than before. Both cats jump up to the rear window and start making their noise again. And it's here when I realize that the car behind me earlier never passed me while I was stopped. I started to slow down to let the vehicle pass me, but after going over a hill, the headlights just vanished and no car ever drove by. I went through another small town and stopped to stretch my legs. It would have been around 10 p.m. now, and I wouldn't have much longer to go, and I started back on the 2-lane interstate and was coming along around 65 to 70 miles per hour. Sure enough, about 10 minutes out of town, the lights returned. This time, though, I said screw it and stepped on the gas. As I approached a bridge heading into the next town, I blew past a police car. He, of course, turned around and lit me up, and I pulled over and rolled down my window, showed him my driver's license, military ID, and badge. He asked me what the hurry was, but seemed distracted while he stood next to my car. He was looking up at the sky, I think. I told him, though, that for the past hour I was being followed by someone, and that no matter what I did, the vehicle behind me just kept pace. He let me off with a warning and told me to take a right at the flashing stoplight and cut through town. He said that he would stop the next car to come through and check them out. He also mentioned that they were receiving multiple claims from nearby residents of weird lights in the sky and weird noises. I thanked him and did as he suggested and didn't have any other issues the remainder of my trip home. If anyone else has had a similar incident, I'd love to hear about it because, quite honestly, I'm stumped with this one. I was about 13 when my family went on our annual trip to Poland to visit my family. My mother and father both came from a small rural village about 2 to 3 hours away from Warsaw. It's an idyllic little place that's surrounded by lush forest and wheat fields. Life is different there because everyone is very carefree and relaxed. Being the small place that it is, everyone knows one another since everyone essentially lives on the same street. I had made a bit of a reputation for myself there, being known as the American girl who visits in the summers, so whenever we would arrive, the whole village would know. I loved the attention, if I'm being honest. All the kids wanted to play, and adults doted on me. One of the townspeople that I saw most frequently was Tomek. Tomek was a funny guy in his upper 20s who would work in the village deli store. He would always give me extra meat any time my grandparents would send me out to pick up food or offer to show me inside the kitchen. I never did take him up on that offer, though. but the idea of seeing how my meat was made was just too much for my 13-year-old mind. Though I didn't know at the time, Tomek had the reputation of being kinda like the town lunatic. He wasn't a stranger to the police force, nor the villagers, as he was a bit of a petty thief. My grandparents told me when I got older that my grandfather had not once but twice caught him trying the doors of his shed and then excusing himself when caught as drunk and unsure where he was. Despite this, though, I never had any reason to fear or avoid him. Now, the village had a tradition called Gra Adwagi, which translates to the game of courage, that would fall in between the dates of our visits. On this day, the village children would be set into teams, and then given items to find that were hidden around the woods or the village parameters. The event lasted all day, and the group that had found the most items would win a prize. The courage part of the game would be trying to attain the golden item, which would be in the woods and guarded by a few adults, armed with water sprayers and water guns and whatnot. The only way to get the golden item was to avoid being sprayed with water. If all members of a team were hit, then the team would lose the chance to attain it. My team consisted of my 4 friends, Eva, Arik, Bartek and Paul. Our strategy was to get as many of the items around town and then try our luck at the golden object when it got darker in order to be harder to spot. We got a lot of items throughout the day and worked up a good sweat after racing against the other children. Around 7 PM we had attained 12 items and were ready to try our luck at the golden item. We had heard from the other children that the adults were being relentless, guarding the object with ferocity. The wooded area, that was the destination, as the golden item area was behind Arik's house. Therefore, he took the lead in devising the plan. Our plan was that we were going to split up into 2 teams. Arik, Eva and Bartek were meant to grab the adults' attention and drive them away as far as possible, while Paul and I would sneak in and grab the item. Feeling confident, we headed into the forest as the sun was slipping from the sky. We followed the dirt path for about 5 minutes and then stepped off it, following Arik as he navigated through the shrubbery with ease. He stopped us just as we reached a thick clump of the bushes. Putting a finger to his lips, he motioned for us to look through the gaps in the shrubbery and see the adults. It was dark now, so it was pretty hard to see who was actually guarding the items, but we could make out 4 shapes huddled together, chatting softly. Without hesitation, though, we moved into our plan of action. Our 3 friends navigated around and disappeared from our sight, only for us to hear their laughs and the voices of adults yelling to get them. Paul and I watched as the adults raced after our friends, all abandoning the area that they had stood around. I remember glancing around and getting ready to jump out of the bushes when I felt Paul's arm on my shoulder and saw him making a shushing sound. "Hey, wait, they might not all be gone, just wait a bit," he urged. We sat quietly, listening intently for any sounds, and then it happened. The slightest sound of something moving on the other side of the clearing. We couldn't make out who or what it was, so we just stayed quiet, peering through the gaps of the shrubbery. Paul saw it first, though. He pointed out what looked like a dark figure crouching behind a tree closest to the clearing. We watched as the figure moved from tree to tree, never stepping out from behind, just simply observing. Just as I was about to suggest that one of us should cause a distraction, we hear a yelp and turn to see another team approaching. Clearly happy that there seemed to be no one around where the golden item should be, we watched as this small group of 2 raced around the clearing but didn't pick anything up. I kept waiting for the adult to step out and spray the kids, but the figure just remained crouched, half visible behind the trees. One of the girls approached the area the adult was, but she was busy looking up the tree, musing to her partner that maybe the object was put up on a branch. We watched as she began pulling herself up the lowest branch, and I remember the way my stomach dropped when, all of a sudden, we saw the adult shoot out from behind the tree, grab her leg, and start pulling her into the darkness of the forest. Her partner ran off screaming, leaving me and Paul unsure what to do. We watched frozen with horror as the adult began covering the girl's mouth in an attempt to silence her. Before either one of us could do anything, all of a sudden, Tomek came running up the path and threw himself onto the man. Paul shot out to help Tomek while I ran back to call for help. When I reached the backyard that was the destination spot for the end of the game, I was screaming uncontrollably in a mix of words that took me a few attempts to get out that help was needed. A large group of men raced towards the forest while I hid in my mother's arms awaiting to see everyone arrive back safely. My friends Arik, Eva and Bartek approached me cautiously and asked what happened and why Paul and I hadn't come back. It had turned out that after Eva, Bartek and Arik had distracted the adults and drove them away, the adults had decided to end the time to get the golden item. They had assumed that everyone had a chance to try to get it and didn't want the kids wandering around the forest after dark. One of the adults had actually already pocketed the item when they chased our group back towards the main backyard. My team assumed that we would see that there was nothing there and return as well, which is why they didn't come looking for us. As I retold what happened, everyone in the backyard listened to me with wide eyes. About 10 minutes passed and we saw the group of men coming back, Paul walking aside his father and the girl who had been attacked in the arms of her assumed father. As they all approached, I asked Paul what had happened. As the parents gathered and talked in hushed voices, Paul described to us how Tomek had beat the guy bloody but let him escape when he turned away, surprised by the men that had arrived to help. He mentioned too that a few men were still out scouting the forest land for the guy. I then asked the remainder of my friends why help was not sent earlier by the girl's partner that had run away screaming. Everyone had looked at me with blank faces and the sudden realization hit me hard. The next events just became a blur. It's a mix of me racing to my parents with my friends and asking about the girl, a frenzy of people calling out her name and begging her to come out, a whirlwind of everyone rushing to get their kids inside, and a mayhem of adults swarming together to go search the woods again and call the police. And it's been 8 years now, and she still hasn't been found. Tomek was one of the main suspects, believed to be a part of a two-man kidnapping operation, but backed out when he saw that too much attention was brought to the event. I'm not sure whatever happened to him, but I can't help but feel guilty that I didn't do anything to help either of those girls. I saw the girl run away. Paul and I were the last to see her, in fact. And sometimes when I see a child with braided hair, I get thrown back to that night and I can still see her braids swirling around her as her figure disappeared from sight. Her name was Dorota, and I hope that she's alive. This is an experience that happened to me when I was in high school, and to this day I still can't explain it. So when I was a sophomore in high school, I had a boyfriend who was 2 years ahead of me. He was all set up to go to boot camp for the Marine Corps when he graduated, and we definitely were in puppy love, and he was my first serious boyfriend. The time came and he graduated. He was going to spend the summer with his dad in California, and I was going to spend the summer with my dad in Pennsylvania. At the end of the summer is when he would ship out to basic training in MCRD San Diego. Over the summer, we would talk, but we had a fight and we actually ended up breaking up. I honestly can't even remember what it was about, but we stopped talking for a while and he went to basic and then went to infantry training and then he deployed to Iraq. He was there for a few months and he emailed me. I returned the email and we talked about it a few times every week. One of the conversations we had was about us breaking up and we ended up arguing about it again. After that, I stopped getting emails from him and I thought that he was just mad at me. It was then my senior year and I was going to do a project for my American government class on the war in Iraq. I came across the casualty page and I saw his picture. It was towards the top because his last name starts with A. I was shocked and I totally lost it. Especially when I saw that the day that he died was the day after our last conversation. I couldn't believe that no one got in touch with me to tell me. I reached out to his mum and she told me that he got rid of anything and everything that reminded him of me. He threw away papers with my number on it and said that she tried to find me, but she couldn't. I personally think that if she tried harder she could have, but then again she was a grieving mother who lost her son and I was probably the last thing on her mind. I asked her how he died and she told me that he was the gunner on top of a Humvee and while on patrol a group of insurgents tried to ram them off the road. The driver of the Humvee swerved and flipped the Humvee and it landed right on my ex. Fast forward through a few months of grieving him, and I'm drinking, using, crying, and all sorts of things, and one night I was home with my mum. Me and her got into an argument, and I called my friend Tori and told her to come and pick me up so I could stay the night with her. She told me that she was out for dinner with her parents, but would call me when she was done. I left my phone on the charger upstairs because it was dying. I went back downstairs and talked things out with my mum, and we ended up watching a movie. I went upstairs after the movie, and I had 5 missed calls from Tori. I called her back, and she said, "Hey, is Rob, our other friend, with you?" I told her no, that it was just me and my mum, and my stepdad was at work. And she said, "Someone answered your phone." I told her that that was impossible, as my phone was upstairs and it was just my mum and I. She freaked out and yelled, "Oh my goodness, I talked to a dead guy." I asked her what he said, and she said that he answered the phone with hello, and she asked if I was there, and he said that I was busy at the moment. And she said that she asked him to tell me that she called, and he said dandy, as in fine and dandy. And that instantly gave me the chills, because my ex used to say that phrase a lot. I asked her if she was sure that she called my phone, and she said that she looked at the phone and it said connected. I hung up on the phone and checked through my calls, and sure enough, there was a recent call on my phone that lasted about 23 seconds. To this day, I just can't explain it. After that happened, though, there were a few times that the thermostat outside my room would be turned all the way down without anyone touching it, and my house was a newer home. Anyways, I really wanted to share this with you guys, and if you have anything negative or rude to say, then please just don't leave a comment. Positive vibes only, as it's a bit of a personal one. Any explanations are welcome, though, and I would love to hear from you guys. So this is something that was super traumatic for me, but it was never discussed again in my household. I was talking with my mum about it the other night, and she still didn't say much. So I thought I would share my thoughts with all of you guys. So when I was 13, I got a Dell desktop for school. The internet was fairly new for me back in 2003. AOL and MySpace, Yahoo Messenger, AOL chat rooms, 16, female, Cali, anyone? AOL chat rooms was where I went most of the time. I was a shy, overweight kid back then, still shy to this day, but online I could be anyone. I could say anything, and it was amazing. I discovered so many things when I got on the internet, and if I could be anyone, so could someone else, and thus is how I met one 27-year-old man. So one night I logged on. The AOL dial-up sound still makes me feel uneasy. I was sitting in my cold dark kitchen. The computer was here, so I could be monitored. It was just me and my mum, though, and she was always working anyway, so no one ever really monitored me, and plus, she had no idea how to use a computer, so I just got away with a lot. I was bored, so I hopped onto an AOL chat room, lurked for a bit, then I said, 15 and female here. I was really 13, but saying I was 15 made me feel so much more mature. And private message incoming. It said, "Hey, my name is Rob, where you from?" And that was how it started. I told him where I was from, that I was in high school, which wasn't a lie. My school was from 7th to 12th grade. And I said you, and he said 19, male, New York. And I thought, oh man, this is cool, I'm talking to an older guy, and boy was he cute. Honestly though, I don't really remember much. Maybe I blanked it out, or maybe my memory is a bit shot, but I do remember emails back and forth though, and the occasional phone call, and I remember finding out that he was talking to another girl, and I wanted to break things off, but he begged and pleaded until I caved. I was nervous. He had never asked for a pic, and had never really asked for much from me. Just the emails back and forth, a phone call a day, but somehow he made me feel safe. It made me feel wanted and cared for. He drove from NY to WV one day. My mum worked right beside my house, so he parked about a quarter mile away and took the back alley to enter my house. My friend was with me when he showed up, but was scared when she saw him and ran out the back door. I maybe should have taken a hint from that, but I just stood on the back porch with my head down, was given a hug as he led me inside, and not 5 minutes after being there, sitting on the couch, did he move things further. Then further, and even into my bedroom, and I won't go into the details on what happened next, but I'm pretty sure that you get the drift. After that he left though, with instructions to get into his car after I get off the school bus and we'll go on a date. I had no idea where he was staying, and I lived extremely far in the country, an hour's drive from the closest hotel. But the next day I get ready for school and ride the bus for the 45-minute drive. But as soon as I hop off, in the school parking lot, I get directly into his car. No one noticed and no one said anything. We drive around and never go on a date. He just finds different places to park so that he can use me. I notice a photo of another younger girl, 15 or 16, in the visor of his car, question him, believe when he tells me that it's his cousin, believe when I question why his hairline is receding so much, believe him when he tells me that I can't see his driver's license because he left it in the hotel, believed him when he said that he loved me. I get dropped off back at school, super sad that he was going back home, with promises that he'll call me. Again, everything feels really fuzzy. I can't remember many emotions from this time, but I do remember that a few days later my mum says that she found out that I skipped school with a man, that I was never to see him again, and that was that. I do remember too sending an email, I remember a late night phone call, and I also remember saying I wish I could just live with you. I also remember him suggesting to come get me, and I remember saying okay. Days later, by the time that he made the drive again, I was feeling iffy about leaving my mum. I loved her after all, and I did think things through. I didn't have much thought into anything really, but I packed a few clothes into a suitcase, forgot all my underwear. That was one of my sharpest memories. I felt bad that he drove 8 hours to get me, so I left in the middle of the night. Got in the car to him and his cousin, and he got in the back seat with me, proceeded to have his way with me while his cousin drove, and then get back into the front seat. This happened a few times between my home and his, and the drive took forever. I had nothing to drink, was offered nothing when they got something. They stopped to take a nap at a rest stop, and I attempted to call my mum, which was disabled on our phone. I dug around for some change to get something to drink, but couldn't afford anything in the convenience store, so I drank out at the truck stop sink. Hours later, we park a block away from his house while he runs to get something, and I'm sitting in the back seat, waking up from a nap, when around 8 or so men and women in black suits surround the car, screaming for us to get out with our hands up. And my first thought was, crap, first 10 minutes in New York and I'm already being robbed? I'm terrified at this point, and I get out and a man pulls me over to the curb while the other officers force his cousin onto the ground. All the while, they're asking my name and age, telling me to tell his cousin my age. I'm put in the back of an unmarked car, driven to the NYPD, past reporters, cameras, news trucks, snuck into the back of the station where I see Rob in handcuffs for the last time. And for, in love 14-year-old me, this was devastating. I'm taken into a room and questioned for hours. I am then taken to the hospital and then a hotel where a nice woman brings me to Taco Bell and stays with me as I fall asleep. The next day, 2 FBI officers escort me home on a plane where I get off and where I'm greeted by police officers, my mother, and a horde of news reporters. I later found out that when my mum reported me missing, that the police didn't want to do much. They didn't even take the picture of me. She had his license plate number, and she remembered seeing his car parked by the road that first meeting. She took notes since it was an out-of-state car, and thanks to her being vigilant, I find out that this is the only reason that I'm alive today. The police said that they would look into it, but that wasn't enough for my mum. She contacted a family friend who in turn contacted the governor of WV, who in turn made the police look further into it. After they ran the license plate number, looked into the man, and found out who he was, that was when they issued an Amber Alert, noting that apparently I was in extreme danger. My cousin told my mum that he looked at Rob's rap sheet and it was a mile long, but wouldn't tell my mother what was on it, for fear of scaring her even more. I never did go to court, I never went to any hearings, but I did fall into a horrible depression. My friends' parents wouldn't let them hang out with me. People spray-painted things on my locker at school, and I had no friends, but most of all I thought that a man was in prison for loving me. When I learned that he got sentenced to 10 years in prison, which he served every year of, I became deeply troubled by this. I was in and out of the mental hospital for years, on a slew of medications, and psychiatrists never talked to me about pretty much anything. I had to process it all myself, and my teenage years were better though. I transferred schools, made best friends, graduated, but still, in the back of my mind, I felt that I was the reason that a man lost 10 years of his life. That is, until I was told that he was let out of prison. A couple of years after he was out, I contacted him on Facebook. At the time, I was around 24 or 25, and he told me that if I ever contacted him again, that he would kill both me and my mother, that he still knows where I live. I had no idea what he planned to do with me. My mum still says that he was selling me to a sex trafficker. I was told that he had other girls my age that he was talking to too. Some good things did eventually happen because of my kidnapping though. Schools all over my state started internet safety education classes. Kids were taught safety, parents were taught how to keep kids safe, and no other girls were taken by this man. I am 29 now, and I'm happy and healthy, and to be quite frank, I have zero remorse that this guy spent so many years in prison. So this happened yesterday. I started a new job recently, and I don't know how to get home without a GPS yet. I text my fiancée and ask if she needs anything, and she asks me to head to the store for a couple of things that she needs for supper. The GPS told me to go a different way than expected, and I thought awesome. A new shortcut or way home is always nice and always appreciated. So it turns me onto this abandoned dirt road. Okay, GPS, I would rather not die here, but whatever, I trust you, I guess. I keep going, and the road gets thinner, and it's 1.5 cars wide now. Houses are basically gone, except for one every 1.5 miles, maybe. I feel like I'm being followed too, and I swear that I see some guy in the woods watching me. I eventually get to a sign, and it says, "Danger, enter at your own risk." Near this sign is another one too, and it's harder to see and also facing another way. And it says, "Hunters are in this area. Those injured without proper equipment are at fault." Oh great, I thought. Can't wait to get shot. I keep going though, and the road is hard to drive on, really bumpy and barely 1 car wide. Now, for a while, like I said, I thought I was being followed, but not sure if I was just imagining it. But now, here I am, looking at this guy on an ATV, a gun on his back, just staring me down. He's barely in view, but definitely there, and he's been following me for maybe 2 miles now, stopping when I stop, and it wasn't my imagination at all. And welp, I quickly back up, but you can't turn around on this road, and I get stuck, and the guy just stares at me. I don't think he's going to help me, by any means, and I eventually get unstuck, and I barely make it off the road before turning around, with the little space that I could, and I end up just booking it out of there. A mile or two down the road, and I see a black SUV behind me. The windows are all tinted black, and it's just following me, and it does so for miles. There was no way that another vehicle was in the same area that happened to be going in my direction. So I start speeding, 20 over now, and I'm getting really nervous. I come to an area where I can pull over, and I do it, allowing the guy to pass. I can't see inside the car, but I do see the head turn to look at me. And after this, I drove a little faster than expected to the store, but I felt that I was justified, because boy, it was one hell of a ride. So I was 11 years old, and at the time I was living in an apartment situated on a street with an ongoing construction. Needless to say, they often tapped into the electricity supply and the power fluctuated quite a bit. Therefore, the streetlights often served pretty much no real purpose, especially in the winters when evening dawned on us with pitch black darkness. This is relevant too, so keep it in mind. From what I remember, it was a weekend that I was supposed to spend at my friend's house. For an 11-year-old me, this was an exciting prospect, having been loaded with schoolwork the entire week. I was to spend what I believed to be Friday night sleeping over and spend the entirety of Saturday at her bungalow, to return home that very evening. What made it even better, though, was the fact that her parents had an event that they could not avoid and therefore trusted us to stay alone in their 2-floor house for the entirety of the 6 hours that they were gone. Back then, the idea of spending a whole night alone with my friend was great. No interference and a whole 6 hours of games and movies in their huge TV. As it turns out, though, my friend had other ideas. So, I arrived at her house just short of 8 p.m. It was already pretty dark out, and her parents had waited for me to arrive before telling us about emergency contacts, dinner and such, and they also reminded us to get their 4-year-old Labrador inside as the weather was acting up and his kennel had a few loose panels which leaked when it rained. This is an important fact to be noted as well. After they left, we watched a few cartoons, had dinner, and we were just chilling in her living room playing cards. And that's when my friend Sid had this ingenious idea of exploring a fenced plot of land a few hundred meters down the street that she resided on. There was no construction happening in there, so what little of that area didn't have shambles was overgrown with plants and weeds. We got the dog inside, leashed it to its long chain that allowed it to roam within reason, got the keys and left the house to make the short 10-minute trip. At this point, it must have been about 10 p.m. In retrospect, this is where we still had a chance to avoid this particular encounter, but being the curious and daring 11-year-olds that we were, we ventured anyways. Rather uneventfully, we arrived and set to climb over the 2-meter wall. Luckily for us, the wall was broken enough in places to make good holds to carry us over. Once inside, Sid suggested that we sit a few meters away from each other for as long as we could till one of us was too scared to do so. We faced each other and walked backwards till there was just enough light to see the general silhouette of the other person. After what seemed to me like a good 10 minutes, I saw Sid's hunched form rise and start to walk towards me. She seemed to be walking rather fast and in a haphazard manner, jumping over rocks and at a kind of daring pace too, even getting cut by some thorns in the process. She came up to me and, just as I was about to laugh and call her out for being scared, she told me to get up because she needed to go feed Shaggy. I remember being really confused because her parents had already filled his bowl with food and he had his water thing which he could operate in case he was thirsty, but I saw her face and let me just say that I've never ever seen her so pale. She honestly looked like she'd seen a ghost or something. So without asking questions, I said okay, and we made our way back over the wall, albeit in a tense manner and rather quickly. But the moment my feet touched the ground, I felt Sid grab my arm and straight up just start sprinting down the street. To put things into perspective too, I had a bruise from the way that she grabbed it for 2 weeks straight. So we ran like hell was chasing us, arrived at her house and went in through her front yard fence gate. It was a towering metal gate without bars, and she told me to unlock the front door while she deadbolted the metal gate's various locks into the ground and the 2 gates to each other. It was at this point, too, that I was starting to panic, but we got into the house and Sid then proceeded to run around the house, locking and closing all possible windows and doors, as well as pulling the curtains shut. I was really confused as to why she was doing all this, and so was her dog, who stood there and followed her around while she did so. After about 10 minutes, she came back into the ground floor living room and, with a very scared expression, explained to me that the reason she did all that was because, while we were sitting apart, she happened to glance away from a few meters to my right to see another human silhouette crouching in the bushes. She thought that she was imagining it until it moved closer to where I was sitting and seemed to be unaware that my friend was watching them. She didn't want to startle me or the person, and so she made up having to feed her dog as an excuse to get out of there without alerting the person still crouching there. After hearing this, I was honestly quite shaken, and we hugged for a few minutes, deciding not to tell our parents as they had very much warned us not to go out of her compound. We didn't want this to be the last our time alone together having fun, and so we peeked out the window and into the street, which seemed to be empty as far as we could see, and proceeded to put it behind us as excitement took over our minds once again. I would love to say that that was the end of it, but what happens next has stuck with me to date, and I hold a fear of that situation from that point onward. To give you an idea of the layout of her compound, her house was surrounded on two sides by a lawn, and the lawn was then surrounded by a wall some 2.5 meters high. The wall had one entrance, which was where the tall metal gates were that I talked about previously. The house itself had windows all around the perimeter, as well as two potential entrances. The first being the front door, while the second being a door to this small attached space next to the house, which was made of see-through metal, like the kind which metal fences are made of, but stronger. This space had a metal door with a lock only accessible from the inside, as well as a door which was on the wall that this space was attached to. However, this door only had a deadbolt and was also made of only light wood. So an hour or so in after this incident, we were upstairs in her air-conditioned room playing games on a computer and talking about whatever it was that 11-year-olds talk about when we heard the dog bark downstairs. It was growling and seemed to bark at random intervals. Keep in mind that her dog was a friendly Labrador who rarely ever growled or barked aggressively. My friend went to get the dog upstairs to her room, and after she returned, she informed me that the dog was standing near the front door growling at it, and that it took a bit of effort to get him upstairs as he kept trying to go back down there. We were really confused as this was unusual for him to do, and thinking that a stray dog may have caught his attention, we decided to go onto the balcony attached to her room that gave us a view onto the front lawn and a part of the street directly in front of the house. And instead of seeing what we assumed would be a stray dog or cat, we looked down to see a person standing very still on her lawn and in front of her front door. In the limited light that we could make out, there were heavy layers of muddy-looking clothing and a head full of hair that looked really matted. The dog was with us at the balcony and was whining to be let outside. We crouched in her balcony, and right as we were about to discuss what we should do, we heard what sounded like the front door rattling as if someone was trying to open it with the handle. We crept back downstairs, only to realize that this person had now moved to the window next to the door and was trying to open that. And the realization hit us then that he was trying to find an entrance into the house by going around the perimeter. Just as we were about to creep back upstairs, my friend grabbed me again and in a hushed tone told me that she had forgotten to lock the attached space door in a hurry before. We both looked at each other and paled as we realized that it would gain the intruder easy access into the house as the inner door had nothing but a deadbolt. And at this point, we heard the windows rattling behind the house, nearly 3/4 of the way back to the front again. The attached door space was a few meters away from the front door, and we were lucky that we had chosen to go around the other side. She told me to wait by the inner door with the dog while she went outside and bolted the metal door. She then informed me to close the door as soon as she returned, and that if she was caught, to let the dog outside and to close the inner door as discreetly as possible as to not give myself away. We were honestly both terrified, and since we had no time to argue about it, I stood guard at the inner door while she went to the outer door, fumbled with the lock, and returned inside practically running as quietly as she could. We closed the inner door, and just then we heard the outer door rattle harshly. Had she not gone there and then, there was a big chance that we would have no choice but to hide in her house had he found his way in. After he tried opening all the doors and the windows, which took a while as he was doing it quite intently and forcefully, we found our way back upstairs and went back into her balcony to see if he had gone away, as we had stood still near the foot of her stairs for a while listening for any further activity. As we looked down, we saw him once again standing in her front lawn, but this time we could see his head was tilted back and it felt like he was looking right at us. However, we knew it was far too dark for him to be able to spot us, as, along with closing all the windows and such, we had proceeded to kill the lights in her room as well as draw the curtains as to not let her little bedside lamp light escape the blinds. And then he just started giggling in the quiet of the night and proceeded to go down on all fours, crawling around the lawn in front of the house while his laughter grew. In retrospect, we should have called the authorities long ago at this point, but being the terrified 11-year-olds that we were, we didn't want to get in trouble for not even being able to follow simple instructions. He did this for nearly half an hour too, only to stand up once again facing the street and then climbing on the top of the kennel in the corner, up onto the top of the wall and jumping down. We still stood in a balcony waiting to see if he would return, but an hour or so passed and he didn't, and that was the last that we saw of him the entirety of the night, till around 2 a.m. and her parents returned. The next morning they were really confused as to why all the doors and the windows were closed on such a pleasant night and why there was mud on the front doorknob. We said that we just wanted to play in the dark inside the house, lying about the actuality of the situation, and to this day, I still don't think the man has ever been caught. So this happened to my dad when he was a teenager. For those of you who don't know Clifford Olson, he was a Canadian serial killer in the early 80s that preyed on children and teenagers. His wife was given $100,000 in exchange for him telling the police where the bodies of his victims were, and he even earned old age pension and low-income assistance while in prison. I tell you guys this just so you know how much you should probably hate him. Anyway, before he was arrested, he was pretty well known in the community and kind of a family friend, despite people thinking that he was a little bit off. My dad knew him and had taken rides from him before, but this day something just felt really off. Clifford pulled up alongside him as he was walking home and offered a ride like usual, but something in my dad's gut just screamed no. He told Clifford that it was a beautiful day and he felt like walking, but the guy seemed very adamant and would not relent. Finally, he acquiesced and offered my dad a bottle of Coke instead, saying that it was hot out and so he should cool off. My dad almost accepted it, but then noticed that the cap had already been removed and placed back on, so he told him that he wasn't thirsty. Clifford gave up pretty easily on that, but then asked again if he was sure that he didn't want to ride. My dad said no, that feeling in the pit of his stomach still screaming at him to run, and finally Clifford shrugged and said, "Your loss," and drove off. Not too long afterwards, one of his cousins went missing and would turn out to be a victim of Clifford Olson. And I truly think that if my dad hadn't have listened to his gut that day, I wouldn't be here because I'm sure that he was the next target. So this happened to me today, and I felt like it was something that I should share here as a caution to others. So I live in a small city not too far from Edmonton, and recently there's been a series of armed robberies happening in and around the area. It's made me wary about walking alone at night, so I found myself home at night more often than usual. It's not the worst, but I dislike having this feeling of unease. But I manage and make do. So today, my dad and his girlfriend, they were invited out to a party, meaning that I had the whole house to myself. I pretty much had the evening planned out. We'll watch some episodes from my favourite soap opera, then switch it over to some classic horror films. So I said bye to them as they left and quickly loaded up the TV. It was not long after I had started up the horror movie that I heard a knock at the door. It wasn't a regular knocking too. If my TV had been louder, I probably wouldn't have heard it, in fact. Thinking it was nothing at first, I went over to the door without pausing the movie, just to confirm that there wasn't someone there. But to my surprise, there was someone at the door. I opened the door, and there stood a slim man. He looked to be in his mid-30s, and that's all I can pretty much say about him. I'm not the best when it comes to describing people, and I didn't really go out of my way to analyze him at that moment. I couldn't tell you if his jacket was grey or black or pretty much anything. The man said that he represented a security company, though, and was going around my area to offer his company services. He asked if the owner of the house was home, to which I told him no, and that he would not be home until late. He then began giving me some quick information about his company. That it was the only one that was locally funded, that it's already being used in several homes on my street, and that it's smart device friendly. He even showed me a laminated piece of paper that displayed all the different devices that could work with the security system. I told him that we weren't interested in having a security system at this time. He proceeded to ask me if my family leaves the house for long trips, which would be a great reason to get this security system. Looking back now, though, this was a huge red flag. But I answered honestly that the house was almost never empty and that we never really went on trips. I also added that he could speak to my dad tomorrow if he was coming back. He told me his team would be leaving to another city tomorrow, thanked me for my time, and then he left. I went back to my movie and pretty much forgot about the visitor. The movie finishes and I decide to check my Facebook to glance the buy and sells. Near the top of my feed is a shared post that caught my eye pretty much immediately too. And what I read next made me completely freeze up. It was from a woman who had also talked to a representative from the exact security company I had been advertised, and this guy apparently knocked on her door softly too, which immediately caught my attention. She noted how the guy never gave his name of business card or anything like that, something I didn't even realize happened for me until I thought back. Overall, she was just really suspicious of the guy, so she asked if he'd wait outside, and as she got some pen and paper to write down his phone number, when she returned, he was gone. The next-door neighbor told her that they saw the man running down the road and into an alley, but the biggest fact that this woman dropped? She contacted the security company, and it does actually exist, but they told her that they didn't send anyone out to this city to go door to door. This shared post is blowing up too, and it seems that it occurred to a lot more people than just me. Some people even showed video from their security cameras of these employees. And there's definitely more than one person pretending to work for this company. One even being a woman, and a lot of strange activity being reported. There was one person that went into a backyard without permission, another person standing in front of the house like they were scoping it out. Knowing all of this now, it makes the entire encounter with that guy at my door kind of terrifying. Was he scoping my house out too? Would he have tried something if I didn't answer? I also wonder, was he hesitant to try anything because I didn't pause my movie? I mean, for all he knew, I could have had a friend over. Luckily, nothing serious happened for the rest of the night, but I will be extremely cautious from now on. If there's one thing that I would advise, it's to be suspicious of anyone who you don't know that comes to your house. Just because someone says that they work for a company doesn't necessarily make it true. You don't know who they are or even what they might actually want from you. I've been a solar electrician now for about 2 years, and I work strictly on the residential side of business as opposed to the commercial work. This is important too, as I go to people's homes every day, and it's always in the back of my mind. You never know whose or what house you're walking into. For a little bit of context, though, I travel for work pretty much every day, sometimes driving between 200 and 300 miles to get to my jobs for the day, which is good for me because I feel cooped up when working in one area for too long. But one job in particular I remember all too well. Now, I grew up in a supposedly haunted house, although I never experienced anything myself. The rest of my family has, so I've always been open to the idea of paranormal encounters and always told myself not to think too much into it. But about a year ago, I had a particularly easy job up in Salem, Massachusetts, which I found interesting because of the famous Salem witch trials back in the 1600s. So, protocol before I arrived at any house is to call the owner to inform them that I should be arriving within about half an hour, and when I called this homeowner, I couldn't hear much on the other end of the call. It kind of sounded like very loud construction equipment, like a jackhammer going off or something. About 10 seconds of that, and I was about to hang up until, almost like a switch, the noise was just gone, and I can hear this gentleman answer the phone finally. I say to him, "Hello, I'm just calling to inform you that I should be arriving at the house in about 30 minutes to install the new arc fault sensor inside your solar inverter." And his response was, "Okay, sounds great. I'm working pretty locally for a change of pace, and I'm doing a little construction job about 4 blocks away, so I'll walk over there to let you in. Now, I didn't think this was out of the ordinary, as more than half the time people have to come home from work to let me in so I can gain access to their solar equipment, as they forget about our appointments all the time, and it's frustrating the amount of times that it leads me to wait for them once I arrive there. So, 30 minutes pass, and now I'm sitting in the driveway of this man's house waiting for him to walk home to let me into it. Wherever the equipment is, it's always different. Sometimes in the garage, sometimes outside, and sometimes even in the basement. But I'm soon greeted by a man in the driveway who tells me the equipment is in the basement. Now, I've watched enough serial killer thrillers and horror movies to now hate the thought of going into some stranger's basement for an unknown period of time, as things can go wrong. A 20-minute job can easily turn into a 2-hour job in my line of work, not to mention that I'm currently in a famously haunted town. So the man brings me into the basement, and at first it just looks like any other kind of unfinished basement, but what had me on my toes about the layout of this basement were the stairs to get into the basement that came down directly into the middle, and you can turn either left or right and sort of make a loop around the stairs. So you really couldn't see the entire basement, no matter where you were while you were down there. The solar equipment was located on the wall of the stairs on the left side, so I put down my backpack full of tools and I began to open the inverter to install the new component. Maybe a minute or so after starting, the homeowner turns to me and says, "Hey, I have to get back to work. Do you mind letting yourself out when you're all finished up?" Which I thought was pretty odd, considering that I'd never let any stranger alone in my house, no matter where I had to be, right? So I said in an awkward tone, "You sure you don't mind?" And he said, "Yeah, sure thing. You don't seem like an evil dude. I can trust you to fix my solar and take off without robbing me or something, right?" It was weird, but I feel I've been in stranger scenarios with even more strange people, so I just kind of brushed it off. A few minutes go by, and to my knowledge, I'm in this stranger's house alone until I hear what sounds like obvious footsteps coming from above me on the ground level of the house. Naturally, I call up the stairs, "Hello, is anyone there?" But there's no response. With my nerves now up, I called the homeowner back, who said that he was just arriving back at his job site, and I said, "Hey, is anyone home in the house?" And he said, "No, my wife is at work and my kids are away at college. Why?" I then ask if he has any dogs, trying to put a rational explanation to the noises above me, and he says, "I have cats but no dogs. What's going on?" I say, "Nothing, I thought I heard someone, but it must have been my imagination." And he said, "Okay, well, if you need anything, I'm only a few blocks away." I hang up and I brush it off, telling myself that it must have just been my imagination. About 10 minutes of not hearing any footsteps pass and thinking that I was in the clear and that it had to have been my imagination running. And just as I had that thought, I swore that I now hear footsteps in the basement on the other side of the stairs from where I'm working. It almost sounded like bare feet walking on solid concrete, almost like a slapping noise, but clearly footsteps. Against my better judgment, I walk over to the other side of the basement holding what I already had in my hand, a flathead screwdriver, as if that was going to do me any good anyway. And when I turn the corner, there's no one there. Now that I can hear my heart pounding out of my chest, I put music on my phone to just try and distract myself, as I only had about 10 minutes left on this job and I wasn't going to get chewed out by my boss for not finishing a job. Certainly wasn't going to tell him that it was because I was hearing footsteps in a house. So I quickly finish the job as quickly as I can while being safe so I don't accidentally shock myself, which isn't as much fun as it sounds, trust me. And with the new component installed, I turned the solar equipment back on and confirmed everything was okay, while packing my backpack of tools so that I could get out of that basement as soon as I could. With everything installed properly and my tools packed up, I calmly walked back up the stairs rather than running as quickly as I could. I can't explain it too, but I feel if you hurry in a situation like this that you're bound to make things worse than you would if you just kept your composure. I walk out the front door of the house and I can finally feel the colour returning to my face. As I'm walking down the sidewalk towards my work truck, I glance down and notice one of those little basement windows. Only this basement window has blinds, which is odd because I can't ever recall seeing blinds ever on a basement window down there. And well, when I looked at the window, I could have sworn that I saw the blinds snap shut and a hand letting go of the side of the blind, as if someone was peering through the middle of them looking at me. And at that moment, all I thought was screw composure, and I hustled back quickly to my work van and locked myself inside as soon as I slammed the door shut. I called the homeowner to, well, 1, tell him the job was complete, and 2, get some answers out of this guy, because who in their right mind would leave someone alone in a haunted house? But when I called the guy, I got nothing but his voicemail. Throughout the rest of the day, I kept calling and leaving messages, asking him to call back, and he just never did. After this occurrence, I've always been looking over my shoulder when working in anyone's home, and unfortunately for me, this was just the first of many hair-raising things to happen to me while I was on the job. So I'll preface this by explaining that I've always been a skeptic regarding paranormal activity, ghosts, stories like that, demons, all that sort of stuff. If you ask me today, I'd still say that I don't particularly believe in that stuff. I find them really interesting and I love scary movies, but I've always been of the mindset that until proven objectively by science that this paranormal stuff is all misunderstandings, hoaxes, or something to that degree. That said, though, I have had a handful of creepy unexplained events happen in my life, none of which have been particularly traumatizing or life-changing to me, but still creepy and unexplained to this day. I've only ever told my girlfriend and my older sister about this stuff. I'm always listening to this stuff, though, so I figured this would be a good place to get this stuff off my chest in a slightly more public manner. I'll be sharing more of these stories over the course of the week, and perhaps one per day so as to not spam everything, but these are 100% true, so there will only be a few of them. But, without further ado, here's Creepy Unexplained Event number 1. So around my sophomore year in high school, I had a small room toward the front of the house. I lived in a raised ranch-style home. For those who know what type of layout that they typically have, my parents had the largest room across from the hall, and my sister had the room at the end of the hall. It was between my own and my parents'. I had a small box TV on one of those ceiling wall mounts that I used to play video games on. I would often play them in bed after finishing homework until pretty late at night. And one night, probably around 11 p.m. to midnight, I'd say, I had finished playing a game and was pretty tired, so I got myself into bed. I spent maybe 20 minutes laying in bed, very close to falling asleep, with my door cracked open just a few inches, and I noticed who I thought was my mum leaning into my door when she said something to me. I was yawning at the time, so I couldn't quite hear what she said, and even though I couldn't tell what she said, it was definitely plainly spoken in English at a normal tone of voice, and then she walked down the hall toward the kitchen. I said, what was that? But I got no reply. So I said, "Mum, I couldn't hear you. What did you say?" No reply again. So I got out of bed and walked to my door, leaned into the hallway and called for her, but all the lights at the end of the house were off, and nobody was in the kitchen like I thought she was. I figured I must have been seeing things and that she instead went into her room, or perhaps down to the hall to the bathroom, which also had a door to her room, so I opened her bedroom door and saw her dead asleep, snoring, next to my dad, also very asleep and also snoring. I tried asking her what she wanted, but she wasn't waking up, so naturally I figured it must have been my sister instead. All I knew for sure was that it was definitely a woman. I opened a door and asked her what she said to me in my room, but she was rolled up in her blankets in a deep sleep as well. I got pretty angry at this point and called her name to wake her up, and when she did, I asked again. And she got really angry with me and said that she wasn't in my room. Now, I was the only one awake in the house before getting out of bed, so it seems like none of them had come into my room like I thought. This freaked me out pretty bad, and so I slept with my door shut and the lights on that night. I've shared some stories on here before, but I would like to say once again that I haven't experienced much supernaturally myself. However, my father, my current and ex-girlfriend have, and all of these upcoming stories are located in my father's current house. So my father's house is a creepy one. It isn't secluded, as we had many neighbours, but it was in no means a suburb. Today's stories will be about my father's first experience, and also my first experience with the paranormal. My father is a skeptical man when it comes to the paranormal. Skeptical meaning that if something is explainable, he will not bother with it. And this fact is what makes everything I'm about to tell you in this post, and more to come, just that much more terrifying. As he used to work graveyard shift for the school district in our town, he would sleep during the day. Back when this incident happened, we only had a cheap futon for a couch. The futon had a metal frame with a dingy cover as the cushion portion of it, and the back of the futon, when locked up into a couch, had vertical hollow bars. The specifics of this futon are actually pretty important. So he told me that one day, while everyone was away at either work or at school, he was having trouble sleeping and was awake for about an hour before being able to go back to sleep. He told me that while he was laying there trying to convince himself to sleep, that he heard someone open our front door, but never heard it close. It's a finicky door, so one has to slam it to get it to actually close. Essentially, he would have heard someone close it. He has reason to believe that it's his girlfriend, now ex, coming home from work early for lunch and thinks nothing of it. While he's waiting for her to come to the bedroom, he suddenly hears heavy footsteps walk around what he believes is our living room and slowly run their fingers, theoretically, across the back of our futon. This is where the description earlier comes in, because there's a distinct metallic kind of thunk sound when someone does so, and not mistakable for anything else in the house. It's the only object that could have made that sound, and he immediately thinks that it's an intruder and rushes into the living room, but no one is there. The door is wide open and no one's in the house. I should mention too that we have a deck made of wood that has a flight of stairs leading down to the ground level. Also, the walls are paper. One can hear anything from pretty much any place in the house. For instance, I can hear my father sneeze in his room while I'm in the living room. This means that he would have heard or at least saw someone walk out the front door and down the stairs to leave the house, and consequently he didn't. This experience had him on edge for months, and he actually tried talking to whatever manifested in the house and taking pictures of it just to get some sense of closure from that day. Now, the next story occurred when I was a teenager. My sisters and I would hang out in the front bathroom to talk and whatnot. Don't ask why, it was just a thing for us for some reason, but one particular day, one of my sisters and I were in there talking to each other when we heard someone sprinting down the hall. It's a very short hall, so it didn't faze us when it stopped abruptly in the end of the hall. We were on edge though, as we thought it was our younger sister and didn't want to get in trouble. As mentioned, my father worked nights and he would be upset when woken up from sleeping. So I open the door, and as soon as I do, this huge gust of wind hits me in the face. Like, you know when someone is running past you? Kind of like that. I looked out into the living room and see my father's, now ex, sitting on the futon just watching TV. I asked her where my sister was, and she pointed next to her and motioned that she was sleeping. I asked if she just heard that running, and she just gave me a funny look. As my heart sank, I slowly closed the door and looked at my sister, who is just frozen with fear. I think we both knew what it was and didn't really mention it for a while. We didn't want to make the story feel any more real than it already did. Time to time, I stay at a friend of the family's house to watch their dog. They live in the same neighbourhood in a large house on a quiet street. The house is the second house from the forest and bike path, which is dim and quiet at night. The rear of the house has glass patio doors with no curtains. They overlook a decent-sized backyard that meets the alley, and on the other side of the alley there is another house, and it's an older house with dark red brick and many small windows. So it was around 2 a.m. and I was eating snacks and watching movies and shows on the couch. If you were looking through the patio doors into the backyard, the living room would be on the left and the kitchen would be on the right. The rear of the couch would face the kitchen and small dining area near the patio doors. So I laid on the couch, just watching American Pickers or something like that, and the dog was on the floor resting and the night was quiet as can be. I had all the lights off, except maybe one. I enjoyed these times when watching this dog because it was quiet and peaceful. It was just kind of nice to have some time to myself. So, laying there comfortably, eating snacks and watching television, I suddenly hear a very loud thud and urgent bang on the patio doors. It freaked me out, obviously, and the dog let out a skeptical growl as I reluctantly peered over the back of the couch. And what I see is the floodlight illuminating the white and wrinkly face of an elderly lady. Hesitantly, I get up and walk towards the patio doors as the dog begins to bark. I see the old lady standing there, and she has a look on her face like she's disappointed in me. In a split second, I thought maybe I had the television too loud, or I had done something else to disturb the peace. So I opened the door, and I was really kind. I asked her if everything was okay, and she said no, everything is not okay, and continued to look at me in disappointment. So I asked her what was wrong, and she asked very firmly, "Where's my husband?" Dumbfounded, I stumbled through my words and asked why. Is he missing? She continues, very firmly and insistent on me giving her a clear answer, and says, "Don't play these games with me. I know you know where he is. What did you do with him?" I felt that something was up, and so I asked her if she was okay and if she had any sort of medication that she took. Insulted, she replied, "Excuse me?" and then pulled an 8 by 11-inch frame photograph of a man out of her purse. She goes on to tell me that the man in the photo was her husband and that he had come to this house for a party and had just never come home. I told her that I was watching the house and didn't know anything about it. She continued her arguments, and I asked her if she needed me to take her to the hospital. Insulted again, though, she told me that she was going to call the police, and she walked away in the darkness. So I stand in the kitchen and scratch my head and say, "What the hell?" to myself, and still shaken, I mute the television and peek out the front door in case she came around. But nothing. From then on, there was just nothing but silence. No police, just dead and eerie silence. I peek out the patio doors and see lights go on and off in the little windows of the house across the alley. I assume that that's where she lived and she's getting ready for bed or something. I lay down on the couch and browsed Reddit for a bit to just try and clear my head. It wasn't until a day or two later that I found out that she had apparently done this before. Her husband did pass away, but she likely just suffered from mental illness, Alzheimer's or something else. I was sort of relieved to find out that it was apparently a common occurrence with this neighbour, but have never been more creeped out or just puzzled by any other experience. I have stayed at that house since, and it hasn't happened again, but hopefully she's found the help that she needs, because if she hasn't, I hate to think what she might do for someone who she thinks may have been kidnapped by me. This happened around 2006 when I was in my mid-20s and my sister, the unfortunate main character in this story, had just turned 21. At the time, she and her boyfriend lived with my fiancé and I, and on weekends we went out to one of two bars that had karaoke, air hockey, etc. This particular night, we were at the bar further out from where we lived in the city, a good half an hour by car. Everyone was having drinks, socializing with people that we knew. It was one of those places, lots of regulars, singing karaoke and nothing out of the ordinary really, except that my sister had started hanging out with these two older ladies who had a liquor store in their purses and were sharing, although I didn't know at the time. As she tended to drink a lot more than me, that was a score for her, less money spent on drinks, but she ended up far more hammered than usual. Towards the end of the night, around 1:45, she was really, really drunk. The aforementioned fiancé, my sister's boyfriend, and I were in a heated air hockey game, planning to leave as soon as it was over. She walked up to us and said that she was going to smoke a cigarette outside. Nothing unusual, everyone did anyway, until we were done. About 5 minutes later, we paid our tab and walked out, but she was not on the porch area where smokers congregated. We went out back of the bar to check for her, inside, in the restroom, and then the large parking lot, and it's notable that this particular bar was in a business park, so there were multiple businesses that were closed, as well as the Mexican restaurant next door, and that had just closed as well. But we searched, asked everyone that knew us, and those who didn't if they had seen her, and no one had. I asked the co-workers from the restaurant that were sitting outside as well. They seemed nervous when telling me that they hadn't seen her, but I didn't think much of that until later. By then, I was in a full-on panic after trying to call her cell about 15 times, only to have it go to voicemail every single time. Being a bit nervous myself, I started searching for her, went as far as to take off my heels and start running down the highway. Honestly, there had been times when she had started walking home in the past, though never from this place as it was so far away from where we lived. The fiancé and her boyfriend thought that we should go to the house to see if she got someone to bring her home. Seemed unlikely, but not totally unheard of. We get home and, again, she's nowhere to be found. Just as we were about to head back and I was going to phone the police, I received a call from the PD on my phone. But they indicated that they had my sister, that there had been an incident, and I needed to get down there quickly. We rushed to the PD, where we were taken into a room with my sister. Her face was red from obvious crying, and bruises were starting to show on her arms and chest. She said that when she told us that she was going outside, she thought that we said that we were leaving then, so she walked to the car. After a few minutes, being drunk and tired, she sat down up against it to wait. And a van pulled up. A young man was asking her directions to somewhere, and she walked closer to try and explain when suddenly the back door flew open and two other men grabbed her and threw her in, taking off. They were rough with her, hitting her a few times while holding her down, saying that they only wanted money. They snatched her purse from her, breaking the straps, and searched it, quite haphazardly, as they didn't find the $30 she had in it. After driving around a bit, speaking in Spanish she couldn't understand, they pulled out a gun, making sure that she saw it, and put a bandana around her eyes, telling her that they'd let her go. She was then driven to some woods by a neighborhood that she didn't know. The door was opened and they pushed her out, telling her to run, that if she took the blindfold off or turned around, they'd shoot. She ran, and eventually she did take the blindfold off and came to the first door that she saw, beating on it and screaming for help. The police were called, she was picked up, and now we are back to my being there, hearing what I feared what happened. There was a report filed, police did a search and did locate the bandana she ripped off, but she was so intoxicated and terrified that she was not able to give a clear description of the van, other than a white older model, or the three occupants other than young Hispanic men. But the investigation turned up pretty much nothing, as no camera scored any of this. Hell, we even had detectives in our home who said, "Look, we need the truth. If you got drunk and just went home with someone and didn't want your boyfriend to find out, that we will file charges on you." But aside from the bruises, broken purse, and her trauma, there was nothing concrete to go on. And that was pretty unpleasant, I must admit. I am still fairly convinced, though, that someone at that restaurant knew something given their suspicious behavior when I asked about her, but the police were never able to find that link. All said and done, too, the guys were never found, and eventually we just moved on in different states. It's now just a story in our lives, but it still makes me sick thinking of what could have happened, but thankfully didn't. I've been awake since 1 a.m. I think, and it's now almost 3 a.m. while I'm drinking wine. I might be developing alcoholism, but I remembered 3 encounters in my life where I've seen shadow people and have decided to share them. The first encounter I saw the shadow person when I was about 11 years old, I'd say. I was on a camping trip with my cousins, and in the early morning everyone was still asleep except for me. I was just staring at the side of the tent when I could see a clear outline of a boy wearing a cap on the side of the tent. Except, instead of being like a normal shadow, it was solid black in comparison to the shadows of the trees and other things casting over the tent. The boy then repeatedly walked back and forth past the tent. We were in the middle of nowhere, and I was pretty terrified considering that I thought a complete stranger was pacing by our tent. When everyone else woke up, we went outside our tent, and there was no one around. I told my cousins what happened, and they didn't believe me. Yet, it was like the boy followed me home because he would appear behind people when I was talking to them outside, in the doorway, or walk along the fence line at just random intervals. His appearance wasn't ultimately creepy besides him appearing at just random places outside over the course of the year. And the last time I saw the boy was when my friend and I had a sleepover and my mother was working, so we were going outside, not sleeping and just messing around obviously. We were in the front yard late at night when we just felt like someone was watching us, so we got a torch and shone it around the yard and then down the street. No one was there, but when we shined the torch over a power pole, we both briefly saw a boy in a cap poking his head out from behind the pole, but even when the light hit him, he was just still completely black. We shone the torch around the pole for a bit, but didn't see anyone, so we just went inside and locked the door. Nothing else occurred as well until I was about 14 and encountered the girl who was ultimately much more aggressive and way creepier. The first time I met the girl, I was half asleep at a family friend's house. The family friend had doors in most rooms except the makeshift guest room that they had curtains in the doorway for privacy instead of an actual door. Again, it was early morning and my family's friend's kids were running around and just making noise. I rolled onto my side to see the shadow of a very tall girl in a dress, holding the curtain open, just staring at me. At first I was annoyed and thought it was a resident of the family friend's house, so I said, "What do you want?" And then she immediately vanished, and the curtain even dramatically flickered as if there was a sudden breeze. After that, I laid there really confused, and eventually I just went back to sleep. A few days later, again when I was sleeping, I could feel the blanket slowly dragging down my body. I assumed the blanket was falling off the bed, so I just felt around with my eyes closed and pulled the blanket up. And then, the blanket aggressively whipped down to my ankles. I, still being half asleep, assumed the kids of the house were being little turds and messing with me, so I pulled the blanket back up, wrapped it like a cocoon around me, and gripped onto the blanket at the top. And I could feel the blanket really roughly and relentlessly getting tugged on. By this time, I was so annoyed and just wanted to sleep, so I said, "Just take the blanket then," letting go of the blanket that basically flew into the air and landed in the entry point of the room. I then sat up and realized that, 1, there was no one else in the room since I would have heard them, and there were no signs of running or laughing from the kids. And 2, the intensity the blanket was pulled off me couldn't be done by a child and was major overkill of blanket snatching. Despite not seeing anything, I was creeped out though and ran down the hall into the living room where I stayed up until the rest of the night. Another encounter with the girl, and the more creepy ones, was when I was sleeping on the couch of my older sister's house. I woke up because I felt a big whoosh of air as if someone ran at mega speed past the couch. I laid there wondering what the hell, and then I saw the clear shadow of a tall girl in a dress run really fast past the couch. By then, I was scared, so I didn't move, and this girl was basically running laps past this couch at super speed with a whoosh every time she passed. Mind you, this was a living room, so to even pick up the speed that this girl was getting at in such a short length of area was supernatural to begin with. I was getting more and more spooked, so I was deciding to make a leap of faith and try and dart into my sister's or her significant other's room, which meant I had to pass the area where the shadow person or version of the Flash was sprinting. And when I moved, the girl just stopped and then walked around to the end of the couch and just stared at me. I was feeling bold enough to tell her to just go away, but when I did, she just came closer to me. I felt around for a cushion and threw it at her, which went straight through her and didn't do anything. She then basically walked up to beside me and started leaning her face towards mine, so I just covered my face with the blanket and started crying, then started saying the Lord's Prayer. I didn't move, and eventually I just kind of passed out until the morning. And when I woke up, my sister actually said to me that if I kept running around at night like that I can get out of her house. The girl would then appear in the corner of my room at night, just at random. I slept with a nightlight until I was almost 20 because of this, and the worst and last encounter with her was in my family home. I had a bunk bed that was a double below and a single at the top. I slept on the bottom bunk, and one night I woke up to pitch black feet climbing up the ladder of the bunk bed, and the weight form on the top bunk as if someone plopped down on it. I stared at the top bunk, not knowing what to do, when the entire bed frame started shaking and rocking as if someone was up there having a seizure. There was no way that I was about to check that out, but then I started hearing a really harsh and rough breathing, with something that almost sounded like growling. So I just started praying because I was too scared to leave the bed, and I then slept on the floor of my mother's room for several days after that. The final time that I saw what I assumed was a shadow person was when I was about 21 and I booked a hotel room with a female cousin. We were going to some sort of event in the city area. My cousin got trashed and I wasn't that interested in drinking. We got back to the hotel and my cousin went straight to sleep. My cousin was laying there sleep-talking and I was playing on my phone. The beds were separated like typical hotel beds with a bedside cupboard in between, and I looked up and a tall shadow of a man was standing over my cousin. He simply appeared from nowhere and I was trying to get my cousin to wake up, and the man immediately whipped his head at me. Because it was a shadow, it obviously had no facial features, but I could tell that it was staring at me. He then basically zoomed towards my bed, which I jumped off of and switched the overhead light on, and he just vanished. My cousin was too drunk to notice, but I kept the lights on all night after that. I haven't encountered anything since then, and I'm also aware that all the encounters seem to have a sleeping aspect, so I'm immediately going to get the sleep paralysis comments. But the thing is that I could move in all of these encounters. I was awake, I was speaking, even throwing stuff. I don't know why it seemed to happen most when I was sleeping or almost asleep, although I did see the boy in clear daylight and in the yard a couple of times. I still don't have any answers to all of this, but boy, do I wish I did. So in 2015, I moved into a new house with my mum and my two brothers, and it was a pretty nice little 2-bedroom with a basement. And you can bet my little emo butt that I took the basement room. So pretty soon after moving in, I noticed a lady that dressed in really childlike clothes liked to walk down the street that we lived on. And when I say that she liked to, I mean that as a bit of an understatement, because I'd see her almost 4 times a day sometimes. To be quite honest, I did think it was a little bit weird, but I didn't think too much of it at the time. That is, until one morning I was locking up the house getting ready to take the bus for school, when suddenly I heard a voice from behind me say, "You know that's my house, right?" I turn around and there's the lady. This was the first time that I got a good look at her, and right away I just knew that something was off. She had thick puffy black hair and she was dressed in what looked like a little girl's outfit, but it fitted her. Her eyes were about as wide as humanly possible and she had a weird little smile. Obviously, I was a little taken back because I wasn't expecting her to be there, so I responded with something like, "Oh, haha, did you used to own it or something?" and she pretty much cut me off with, "Yes, that's my house." I honestly had just no clue how to respond to that too, so I tried to be polite and I was like, "Oh cool, we love it here a lot too." And then I excused myself so I wouldn't be late for the bus. I noticed though that she stayed in my yard after I left, but again I didn't think too much of it. Soon after that, I started hanging out in my driveway more often, smoking cigarettes and other degenerate teen stuff, and every time she walked by, she would start waving and clapping, but with only one hand, if that makes sense. And she would always say, "That's my house." I told my mum about this, and she just kind of shrugged her off as one of the many tweakers in the hood, and so I did too. That was until I started noticing decorations and things in our front yard and driveway just started disappearing. I again shrugged it off as the tweakers until one day I was standing in my kitchen and noticed the "my house" lady in my driveway grabbing some toys that my little brother left out earlier that day. I walked out and sternly asked, "What do you think you're doing with those?" She dropped a couple and slowly turned around and walked away without a word. She kept a little inflatable ball though, and I didn't know if she was dangerous, so I just kind of let her take it. Later that week, I was sitting with some friends outside hanging out when, out of nowhere, the ball came rolling down the driveway and I saw her whip around the corner. It was spooky, but whatever, right? She seemed to be harmless, but I was home alone one day in my room, and let me explain some stuff really quick. One, our front door didn't lock right, so you'd have to turn it twice to make sure it was really locked. That's something my mum and older brother always forgot. Two, the floors were made of the creakiest wood, and I lived in the basement, so I could always tell if someone came home. And three, no one was coming home for hours at this point. And those were the three things running through my head when I started hearing someone upstairs walking around. I love my mum, but the woman can walk on carpet and still make a loud noise. So, whoever was upstairs, it definitely wasn't my mum. But they were walking with a weird shuffle too that none of my family would do. I don't really know how to explain it too, but it was just kind of like 2 steps and then a pause and then 2 steps and a pause again. Anyway, I grabbed my machete and slowly walked up the steps. My heart was beating like crazy and I froze up at the last couple of steps. I couldn't hear the floor creaking anymore and I slowly turned the corner and all the doors in the house were wide open, including the front and the back doors. I searched the whole house twice and there was no one there, thankfully, but I did notice that in the front room a plant was missing. I was honestly so scared I just stupidly didn't call the cops because I figured I didn't really have much of a lead anyway. Flash forward a couple of weeks and I was again sitting in my driveway. A couple of my friends were pulling out of the driveway and waving goodbye to me when suddenly they went pale and started waving at me to run inside frantically. So I ducked into the side door and peeked out and there's the "my house" lady carrying the plant that went missing and waving in a weird frantic way saying, "My house, that's my house," at my friend's car window. And that's when she saw me and started walking up the driveway at me waving and carrying on. This time, I was actually pretty scared, so I ran inside and locked the door. I checked later and the plant, a little jade, was outside the side door that I ran in. And at that point, I immediately got chills. I later found out from my friend too that she did some stuff straight out of a horror movie. Apparently, when he went to check out his window for oncoming traffic, the "my house" lady was standing right outside of his window tapping and doing her weird hand movements. I was home alone quite a bit in that house too, so I'd usually shut all the blinds and lock all the doors because it was pretty scary. But one day I was with a couple of my friends at the kitchen table, placed in front of a window facing the street, and we were talking about the "my house" lady and getting all worked up and scared when suddenly my friend Charlotte screams, "There she is!" And she was outside the window doing all this weird stuff. We all immediately hit the floor like someone was firing bullets in the windows. We stayed there for a while and eventually she just walked off. We had a lease for a year there, and she wasn't too harmful, just pretty weird and kind of creepy, so We figured we wouldn't call the cops unless something really serious went down. She seemed in need of a caretaker or something of the sorts, but that was never our place to figure out, so nothing was ever really fixed. But one day, I was sitting in the driveway smoking a cigarette when she walked by doing her weird stuff, and I got up and walked over to her. I said to her, "Did you used to own this house?" And she said, "Yes, this is my house." I asked her, "Did you live here with your family?" And she said, "This is my house, only my house, and all the houses here are mine." Please note too that my heart was beating so fast when I was talking to her. But I said, "So you own all of them?" And she said, "Since I came on that bus, they've been mine." I excused myself from the conversation at this point with a phone call, and she continued on down the road. I'm sorry that I don't have a climactic crazy ending like a lot of other stories, but I figured that she was just harmless, so I didn't want to bother her. In our last few months there, I noticed her less and less though, and I talked with a couple of neighbours and figured out that she was stealing people's stuff from their front and backyards and trying to pawn it off at the shops, and I guess it caught up with her at some point. Someone also told me too that they think that she got the greyhound treatment. It's honestly pretty sad, and I do hope that she got some help. Connecticut is rich in history. It's filled to the brim with historical sites and home to some important events in history too. However, Connecticut is also rich in paranormal events. It's been noted to be one of, if not, the most haunted states in America. If you were to go on Google and search Connecticut hauntings, you'll find plenty of examples of famous hauntings that have happened in CT, as well as a couple of famous movies. However, we're going to focus on just one today, in Dudley Town. In northwest CT, there's a town called Cornwall. It's rich in farmland and good old country folk. It's gone through quite a few changes over the years, but one of the most notable, and not well known, is the small section of Cornwall known as Dudley Town. It rests in a secluded area, supposed to be an Indian tribal ground in between three hills, and the town has been abandoned since the late to early 1800s. Now, there's people out there far more versed on the town history than I am, but I know enough to share with you what makes this town so interesting and so creepy. So in the mid-1700s, the Dudley family moved onto a secluded plot of land after moving to America from Europe. The Dudley family had been known for being followed by a curse that had followed their family all around Europe. Moving to America was hopefully the beginning of a great fortune and a curseless life. The family soon found out that the curse may have caught up with them, though. They had found that the land that they had purchased wasn't much good for farming, as the soil and dirt was completely filled with large rocks that went deep into the ground, which, let's be fair, isn't much of a surprise considering that every side of the town was surrounded by mountains. Because of the mountains, sunlight would vanish early into the day, so plants struggled to survive. By midday, the town was completely covered in shadows, and nighttime came early, leaving the village pitch black until the following morning. The Dudleys did make some money off their timber, however, surviving did not come easily as they had hoped. The Dudleys' curse had begun to rear its ugly face after a short while too. Citizens of the village started to experience bizarre happenings. Some people had reported very strange creatures lurking in the surrounding forest. Some of the workers cutting down timber had reported seeing sickly animals lurking in the forest. They had reported seeing bizarre creatures that they'd never witnessed before walking around the outside of town. Some villagers had even reported seeing demon-like creatures skulking around town. After the reports began to circulate, strange occurrences began to arise too. Townsfolk had begun to die, often, some due to accidents while working, and some in ways that just couldn't quite be explained. People had also started reporting family members and friends acting just strange. Shortly after, reports of demonic possession began to circulate through town. After a while, people began to leave town and find shelter elsewhere. Eventually, the town was completely empty, the houses were torn down, any remaining useful lumber was cleared out, and all that remained was some old cellars and foundations of old homes. Dudley Town remained a sightseeing attraction for paranormal enthusiasts for years to come as well. However, it also became a popular place for vandalism. Due to the vandalism too, the local police began to keep their eyes on the main road in Dudley Town, also known as the Dark Entry Forest. But while Dudley Town is still accessible by hiking trails, the police have made it quite a bit more difficult to access. I went there with some friends back in high school in 2006, maybe 2007 actually, and while we didn't personally have any experiences that night, we did notice that the town had just a bizarre silence to it. No crickets, no birds, no bats, nothing. Which, for a Connecticut forest, is pretty bizarre, I must admit. I mean, our forests are generally lush with living creatures just everywhere, and for there to be any silence is pretty much unheard of. But the town just absolutely has an extremely bizarre and negative energy to it. You'll also catch from time to time a strange wind come through town. You won't hear any leaves rustle from it, you won't ever hear the wind itself, but it'll be a frigid wind, even in the middle of summer, and when it does make a sound, it can very easily sound like whispering, which may be explainable by the mountains, I suppose, or possibly something else, but it's still a bit creepy. Now, as I said, when I went there, I didn't experience much. It was extremely creepy and the energy was definitely off, but there was nothing much to it besides that. However, our friend Jason had brought us down there, and he's actually camped out overnight in the town, and he's a veteran of exploring Dudley Town. And on the hike in, he had actually told us a few stories of his experiences over the years. Now, as they're stories from a third party, I can't corroborate any of the stories, but I would tend to believe Jason myself. Possibly with slight exaggeration, I suppose. But one of the stories he had told us was about the first and also last time that he had camped out overnight there. So he and two of his friends had set up a tent in the foundation of an old house. But while they were laying the tent, getting ready to go to sleep, they all had heard what sounded like someone wearing boots walking across a wooden floor. It only lasted for a couple of seconds, but it definitely freaked everyone out enough that they weren't able to fall asleep that night. He had explained that at this point, they were all really exhausted, although couldn't sleep, so perhaps the exhaustion played a part in their experience, but the fact that everyone experienced the same event made it hard to blame the exhaustion. After the footsteps, though, everyone sat up in the tent and began to talk about what they had heard and were all a bit shocked. Jason had decided to light up a cigarette a minute or so after the footsteps. However, it refused to stay lit. He would light it, take a puff, and then it would just go out seconds later. He had begun to get frustrated with it and actually threw the cigarette out the tent. He checked his watch and decided that maybe it was just a good idea to try and get some sleep again. But when he checked his watch, it was about 1:33 a.m. and they had to be up by 5 a.m. They needed to pack up and leave before sunrise in case any police came through to patrol. Everyone talked for a minute and tried to fall asleep again. They all laid down and tried to sleep, and everyone had tossed and turned, and none of them were able to stay comfortably, and they all had complained about just the sensation that their skin was crawling. They also had all experienced sudden hot flashes, and all night they just felt as though someone was watching them. Eventually, Jason had finally sat up and decided that he wasn't going to be able to sleep after all. He pulled out his phone to text his girlfriend and noticed that his phone had said that it was 1:35 a.m. They were all really confused. They felt as though they'd been tossing and turning in their sleeping bags for at least half an hour, but it had only been a couple of minutes. For the next hour or so, they sat in their tent smoking cigarettes and having random conversations. However, their camping trip was turned upside down when, at around 3:20 a.m., they heard a loud crunching of leaves coming from the forest next to them. The footsteps came out of nowhere, and they didn't hear the footsteps start farther away and come closer. They just seemed to start out of nowhere, at most 30 or 40 feet from the tent. They had thought that maybe it was a bear or a deer possibly, but the footsteps were just abnormal. Jason had described it to me as though someone would take 2 quick steps and then stop for a second or two, and then take another 2 steps, stop for a second or two, and then another 2 more quick steps. Almost as though someone was leaping from one point to another. And everyone in the tent began to panic a bit, Everyone had a weapon of some kind in their hand, and everyone sat there frozen while the footsteps circled the trees outside of the tent. The footsteps stopped after a minute, but they didn't seem to walk away from the tent. They just stopped. And at this point, they began to panic that maybe someone was outside watching them from the trees. Jason's friend had yelled out something like, "Is somebody out there?" To which there was no response. After a few minutes, they decided that they should probably check. So Jason grabbed his flashlight and so did the others. They slowly opened the tent, shining as much light outside as they could. They pointed their flashlights towards where the sound was coming from, but when they did, nothing was there. They kept the lights on the trees for a while when they heard a very deep, very guttural and raspy growl from the trees behind them. They all spun around, flashed the lights, and behind them was a rather open section of the town. The nearest tree line was about 100 feet away, and they saw nothing in the openness. And at that point, they all decided that it was time to leave. They grabbed their valuables, but actually left the tent as they were too freaked out to bother packing up their tent that they spent $40 on at Walmart the day before they went out to town. And Jason told us that the hike back was truly nerve-wracking. The entire 10-minute hike out of town, they just felt as though they were being watched and something was trying to push them out of town. But once they had gotten out of the Dudley town limits, their anxiety and hot flashes, cold sweats, and feelings of being watched just all melted away. Now, as I said, I personally don't have any real experiences to write about, although I would love to go back to Dudley town one of these days and see what I could find. Over the past years or so, the police surveillance has inflated quite a bit in that place, though. For instance, the main road in town isn't accessible without going past a handful of police. The walking trails that would lead you into the backside of town are also under surveillance. There are still a few ways to get into town, but it'll take around 30 to 45 minutes hiking to reach it. However, once you enter town, so long as you don't make your presence super known, you're pretty much home free. The police only go into Dudley town itself if there's reports of anyone being there. And Jason very well may have told us a tale just to get us a little on edge before we entered town, or maybe it was an actual true story. To be honest though, after his dozens of visits, I wouldn't be surprised if the events happened on different trips and he combined them into one hellish evening. If you live in CT, NY, or MA, Dudley Town should absolutely be on your paranormal bucket list. The Warren family investigated Dudley Town in the 1970s, and Lorraine verified that apparently there is absolutely multiple demonic presences in town. So this happened a while back, and I thought that I'd share this here. And it's a bit of a long one, so please bear with me. So me and my boyfriend at the time were living in this semi-spacious studio apartment that belonged to his dad. But we had just moved back from England and needed somewhere to stay while we looked for a new place. It was newly renovated and we had to be out of there pretty quickly because his dad wanted to start renting it out. There's no way that we were able to afford the full rent for this place, so we just gave him what we could spare, and I guess his dad wasn't all too hot on the idea of his son and girlfriend, 18 and 21 at the time, living there, being as young and stupid as we were together. It was on the 3rd floor, and he recently got a permit to build a roof deck outside. You can walk onto it through the kitchen, and it's kind of level with the neighbor's bedroom window. We were aware that it must have felt a little invasive, so we tried to be considerate about how late we went out on it and regarding the noise and stuff. The tension started to grow between us when we were outside on a Saturday night, though, having a smoke, and we were just talking at a reasonable volume when suddenly we hear a harrowing, "Will you both please shut up and go back inside?" I looked at my boyfriend and I just burst out laughing. I looked around to see where it was coming from, and it was an old, sweaty hippo of a man peering out of his window, gasping for air as he looked at us as if he was about to kill us. My then boyfriend said, "Mate, you should just ask us normally to keep the noise down." To which he started spewing countless obscenities and barked at us to go back inside. We didn't want his dad to get any complaints about us, so in the end we just went back into the house. Several days later, we got a phone call from his dad saying that the neighbor had called him, saying that we were blasting loud music all weekend, screaming, and had loads of people over. He also said that he had to call the police. The thing is, though, is that even if he had called the police, we would have been none the wiser because we weren't even there. That Sunday morning, we were going out of town for a few days, so it just made no sense. Over the course of a few weeks, though, every time we'd go out to water the plants on the deck or hang up some washing and stuff, he would use any excuse to just shout abuse at us. It was really traumatizing too. The pressure in your house is too high, your clothes are blocking my sunlight, and some mornings we would eat out on the deck and he would complain about the noise of our cutlery clanking on the plates. I mean, it was pretty ridiculous. He would even constantly tell us about how the roof deck shouldn't even be there, so we gave him a copy of the approved permit. But anyway, one afternoon we were kind of getting busy on the couch, nothing too R-rated, but enough to maybe think of getting curtains that weren't as see-through as ours were. So we're doing our thing and, out of nowhere, he looks up and out of the window and his face just drops. He gets up and walks towards the window and says, "What the hell?" I practically jump out of my skin and ask him what's wrong, but before he would even answer me, he leapt outside onto the deck and started banging on a neighbor's window. I asked him what just happened, and he said that he was filming us. I could see a red blinking light through his blinds. At this point, I was just like, there's no way. I mean, I genuinely didn't believe it at the time and told him that it was probably something else. Quite understandably, though, he wouldn't let it go. In fact, he would go out at night and try and look through his window for filming gear. You could only see so far back into his room, though, so there was no actual certainty that he had any of that stuff to begin with. But one day, he left his window open, so I guess he wasn't home. Bear in mind, this was over the course of several weeks, and he actually climbed halfway through his window, standing on the garden table, and just freaked because at the end of the room, there was just this wall of videotapes with all of these dates and names written on them and loads of heavy-duty camera equipment at the end of his bed. We obviously called the police and told them that we were being stalked. Maybe it was just a coincidence at the time, but I think our suspicions were justified considering his character. He was honestly just an all-out horrible and creepy guy, and if he had footage of me half naked, I wasn't going to take that chance. The police informed us that we didn't have sufficient enough proof that he was able to film us, but they would question him. Without any real evidence, they weren't able to get a warrant to search his house for the tapes, which was a bit of a bummer. So after a while, we decided that the only way to do this was to catch him in the act. It was pretty calm between us for a while. After we involved the police, he just stopped bothering us, but I still wanted those tapes. So one night, we just got back from dinner, and we were about to go to bed, and we hear a knock at the door. It was actually our other neighbor, who was super cool. Asked us about the neighbor that we were having issues with. Total understatement, but the whole street knew that we were on bad terms. Everyone usually kept to themselves, but they all hated this guy. And we told her the whole story, and after talking to her for a while, she offered to call the police and tell them that she also witnessed him filming us. The police came around the next day and informed us that, with our neighbor's testimony, that they were indeed able to acquire a warrant to search his apartment. A few days later, we watched the entire thing go down, and 2 police officers showed up at his apartment, gave him a letter, and we just watched the whole thing. And an hour or so later, he was arrested, and that was apparently that. We didn't hear anything back from the cops for a while, that is, until we got a call saying that he actually had been filming us for months. He actually had footage of us eating, of us napping on the couch, me getting changed, my boyfriend working out. It honestly sent shivers down my spine because not only was I absolutely furious, but I was really freaked out. We obviously pressed charges and eventually he got a few months jail time. We also moved out, but I never found out what they did with those tapes. And I think they're probably in an evidence locker right now. Alright, so this story is going to be about 2 encounters, as I feel that they're probably related. It's about aliens, I think, but like many things that happened to me, I really have no idea. So Newfoundland is an alien hotspot if the stories that I hear are any indication. Almost everyone that I know has some story about when they lost huge chunks of time and were missing, usually for about a day, but it can go as high as a week. I've never heard any violent encounters, but a lot of I was frozen and couldn't move for a bit due to light from the sky once. It's a pretty good assumption that if aliens do exist, they stalk my family. My dad has stories about being frozen on beaches, being watched in his sleep, and a weird story about the stars changing configurations. My mum has stories about meeting aliens, and she even has a few accounts of what they look like. I might tell those stories one day, but I feel like this is a good introduction to the types of encounters that my family's had. So it all started when I was about 13. There's nothing overly remarkable about me, other than being in a military family and I was more precious than most. At the time, I was living in my dad's hometown, maybe a solid kilometre up a hill, I suppose. My house was a raised bungalow, meaning that all the first floor windows were about 10 feet off the ground. My window faced the front yard, and it was probably the only one that didn't have some kind of bush in front of it. Basically, that means that I had a good solid view of my outside. Now, one night, I remember being woken up fairly abruptly around 1 in the morning, I'd say. Not unusual for a 13-year-old, so I thought I'd go and get a drink, probably pee, and then just go back to bed. Except, when I tried to move, I just couldn't. Some people describe the feeling of an overbearing weight that prevents them from moving, but this wasn't that. It was like my whole body was asleep, complete with the tingly feeling and utter lack of ability to move. I wasn't sleeping in a weird position, and aside from having maybe an extra blanket on the bed, I couldn't figure out a reason why this was all happening. But the only thing I could move was my head, as my neck felt asleep, but not enough to completely prevent movement like the rest of my body. So I flopped my head to one side, and that was when I saw it. In my window, roughly in the middle, was a disc-shaped object. It hovered maybe a foot away from the glass and didn't move. Now, this is remarkable for anyone who's been to Newfoundland, where 40km/h winds are the norm basically every day. The disc was maybe 3 feet in diameter and the better part of a foot tall, and it lit off this low-grade, almost LED-like hue. It reminds me of those horrible blue Christmas lights. The thing had 3 thick, prominent ridges on what I assumed to be the front of it, which was facing me. From the middle one came a red light, and the thing didn't have a lens, it just kind of emanated from this thing. It split into a wide vertical pattern and was scanning my body. When I moved my head, the disc was beaming around my belly button area, and as soon as my head flopped, with maybe a second or so delay, it moved the scanning laser to my eyes. For maybe 5 seconds, I just stared, rather uncomfortably, into this horrible red light, and it kind of burned. I wanted to close my eyes desperately, as it felt not dissimilar to staring into the sun, but they just couldn't move. I tried to yell, as I recall, holy hell, but I couldn't say anything. And, much like staring into the sun, you see little else. After the 5 or so seconds, though, the light turned off, and I could just make out that disc object flew off down the road towards the ocean. I was awake for maybe 10 or more seconds before I just fell asleep. For full context, too, this happened in about 20 seconds, give or take. I need to point out, too, that this happened in 2003 in rural Newfoundland. At the time, there were no such thing as drones. In fact, drones were the terrifying flying machines the US were sending to bomb the crap out of Iraq at the time. I had only recently seen them on TV as those big white plane-looking things, and I have no real explanation for this other than possibly aliens, I suppose, but I tried to talk to my family and classmates about it, but they mostly called me a loony and just laughed at me. Eventually that night passed from me, though, trying to tell people about it. No one will believe me, so why bother, I thought to myself. A month, maybe 2 passes, and my life just carries on as normal. The only real difference, though, is that I just became terrible at math all of a sudden. I was a top student in my class, always pulling best grades for most of my school life until that point. Given the math isn't all that hard, but at this point, I just really started to suck. My grades went from 90s to 60s, often 50s, and sometimes even failing in the math that I was able to do not even 4 months ago. No one was concerned for some reason, but that was a frequent theme in my teen years, so I was now just the kid that had fallen from grace. Still had amazing grades and everything else, just never again in math, which was really weird. Anyway, so one night, I remember being woken up, again my body feeling like it was asleep, and again I had some control over my neck, but I remember this like I remember a dream kind of, but way too many details for it to be normal, but I'll get to that. But the first thing that hits me though is the blinding white light. It was coming from outside my window, brighter than stadium lights and coming from who knows where, but I knew it was close to my house. And all I heard was a low growling hum coming from outside. In my room were 2 of those discs that I'd seen before, shining a wide red light all over the room, which dampened the sheer brightness of the light outside enough that I couldn't see anymore. And then I see one of them. It walks into my room, and I remember being scared-ish, but largely indifferent to be honest. It was easily over 12 feet tall and was uncomfortably skinny. Its arms and legs were way too long for the tiny torso it had, about the size of maybe a child. They were multi-jointed in at least 7 places that allowed it to fold up its arms and legs enough that it could fit in my room. I have no doubt that if it were to fully extend all of its joints, that the thing could easily top 20 feet. It had hands which had too many joints in its fingers, way too many fingers and no thumbs. They were in a half circle around its pretty round palm, and generally, it was pretty unsettling now that I think about it. It had a head, a huge head, but it lacked any real eyes except for maybe tiny pinpoints where a massive socket would otherwise be. It had no nose, no hair, no real chin, and 2 holes where cheeks would be. I'm guessing that might be a mouth, but hell if I know. The head was thin because, of course, the whole thing was thin and resembled somewhat of an oblong pancake, I suppose. The whole thing had white skin with a grey undertone, or what I assumed to be such given the light of the room. The creature, though, held out its hand, and instinctively I held it back. It walked me out of my room, stark naked, and was leading me to my living room. When I got into my hall, I see all the doors in my house are open, and there are dozens of these things just sort of mulling about. I remember one looking in our linen closet, one walking into our basement, and another unscrewing a light bulb or something. All over the house were the discs that gave everything that faint red tint, and the huge stadium lights from outside making it look like broad daylight, but with a slight red tint. In the dining room was my mother, also stark naked, kind of just standing there as 2 of these creatures were in my kitchen doing something. And lying on the couch in my living room was my dad, again naked, with 3 of the creatures looming over him with a bunch of weird tools in their hands. I can only assume, too, that they were doing some kind of procedure. I remember asking, "Where's my sister?" to which I get the reply, "Outside," from the creature holding my hand. I'm still unsure, though, if I heard this from inside my head or if the creature said something out of its uncomfortable holes, but I accepted that as good enough of an answer. As I walked by my dad, I could see the creatures were fiddling with my dad's junk, poking and prodding it. I remember being concerned, as I knew my dad had just had a vasectomy, but again, I just got the feeling that everything would be okay. The creature I was with placed me in the corner of the room, facing the wall, and I sat down cross-legged without much issue. The creature then left, and I was there for about a minute or so. All I can remember from that time is a few details. Above me was one of the discs shining its broad red light, but I had the faint blue as well, giving my vision an odd hue. And the only other distinguishing feature that I remember is the silence. The piercing and utter silence, only broken by a soft, low, growling hum coming from outside. I remember then waking up, back in my bed, no worse for wear, and all I think is, damn, that was a weird dream, and went about my day. The only difference, though, is that I had and still have a small lump on the back of my neck the size of a split pea. It comes and goes, and sometimes I feel it and sometimes I don't, and a few times I've squeezed it and some dry kind of powdery substance came out. I just assumed it was weird pus, but if it ever happens again, I might try to get a good look at it. A few years go by and me and my dad were chatting and we got on the topic of aliens somehow, one of his personal favourites. I tell my dad about the multi-jointed creature thing, and before I can get to the point where I reach the living room, he says, I had a dream just like that. A bunch of skinny white men with hoods were cutting my junk, red hue over everything, and I remember seeing them sit you in a corner and you just sort of stayed there for a bit. Crazy dreams, hey? I asked if it seemed real to him, and he said, well, yeah, I had those kinds of dreams since I was a kid. The white guys in the hoods never do anything interesting. This was the only time. Our brains are weird, aren't they? I've brought it up a few times since then, but I just really don't get a whole lot more than what I've told you. My sister has somewhat of a similar story, but she also remembers like 3 seconds of it. I, personally, have about 2 minutes, I'd say, and the best guess that I've come up with is that it's aliens. But like I said at the beginning, this is far from the only time that I encountered these creatures. I'll save that story for another day, though, and I hope you guys enjoyed this. So, before I really get into this, I just want to note that I was probably about 9 years old when this happened, and I'm about to move back to this very rich in history concerning Native Americans and the Revolutionary War town that I lived in. So I recently moved into an old 1940s craftsman house in a small Maryland town, and the only thing that I knew about the place was just some details about the house that I probably shouldn't have even known at my age then. I was always a kid that really enjoyed learning about the paranormal and cryptozoology, dinosaurs. So when I found out that the older owner of the house was a doctor that died of a heart attack there, I was saddened for the doctor, but excited that a ghost might actually be in the house. But looking back, that was the least of my worries. So it all started when I used to play in the yard that summer. I used to hang out on an old tire swing that was there when we first moved in, and I noticed that there was some sort of gully, like a thing that appeared to be filled up. And when I asked my mum to take a look at it, I then learned that it was actually a creek that got filled up. We were both confused as to why it was filled up in the first place, but I was soon to find out. Shortly after that, I started digging around the creek thinking that I could dig up dinosaur bones, but I found other things. My mum and grandmother were kind of startled and yet again baffled that I started bringing small toys to them from the filled up creek. Things like marbles and plastic letters. But we didn't think much of it until one day I brought them a stone arrowhead from the filled up creek. It was an actual stone arrowhead too, because we'd even bought them at a local pawn shop in town that collects and buys off artifacts like that from the area, but I actually wanted to keep it because it was, well, my first archaeological find. And I kept digging them up that day. When night came, I had to sleep in my grandmother's room since my bedroom was still being painted upstairs. I lived with my mother and grandparents at the time, and they were all heavy smokers, so they gathered up on the porch to smoke. I also had 2 dogs and a bird. The bird was in the parlour, far from my grandmother's room, and the dogs followed my grandparents and mum out onto the porch where they smoked. Now, I was trying to sleep that night, but something just felt off. The windows were open and it was really warm in the room, but there was no breeze coming in. The night was just dead still. My grandmother had this a fake palm tree on this tall end table right next to the window in front of my bed, and I was just about to close my eyes until the tree just started to shake audibly, like there was wind flying through it or someone was shaking the branches, but there was no one there, and there was definitely no breeze. I really thought it was just my imagination at first, but it just kept shaking, so I screamed for my mum at this point. She burst into the room, and the palm tree stopped shaking, and I told her what happened, but she suggested that I was dreaming and I needed to just go back to sleep. So I tried to sleep, but when she left, it started shaking the same way again, and I screamed for her again. She got angry with me and yelled at me and then left the room. Things seemed to be fine too until the room just went cold, as if there was an air conditioner. The window let in no breeze and the house was too old for central air, but I wasn't going to complain since it felt nice, but my nerves were definitely on edge. I tried to go to sleep until I heard a light and audible female whisper from across the room, and I shot up and sat up and looked around for who was whispering, and I saw her. I still have nightmares about her, and she had to be as tall as my grandmother, about 5'2", and she was just stood in the corner of the room. She was still, dead still. She wore a long black dress with some sort of print on it, and her skin was so pale grey that it could have been white for all I know. Her eyes were huge along her normal face, and her eyes were completely white, pure white. There was nothing else in them. Her hair was long and black and a little frizzy or matted, I suppose. I couldn't see her feet from where I sat, but we made eye contact for what seemed like forever, though it was probably just a solid minute. I was too scared to scream or move or do anything, but when she opened her mouth a little as if about to speak, I just dove under my covers and I tried to hide. It took me a few minutes to muster up the courage to scream, and this time everyone came running into my room. The dogs looked uneasy. They were looking for something in there, and my mum asked what happened, and I told her that I saw a woman, and she looked at the arrowheads on the nightstand and just shook her head. My grandmother looked at them too and said to get rid of them right now. And so my grandmother went to bed with me that night, and in the morning I buried the arrowheads and all the toys. Nothing ever seemed to happen again after that, and I never saw the woman again either, but it's an experience that I'll never forget. It was a Sunday, early in the morning. I live in the suburbs, but my parents own a farm that I enjoy going to because I get to see my dog. Her name is Molly. She's a mutt, but she's not a tiny dog by any means, and at the time I felt pretty safe around her and would often take her for walks in the forest that was nearby. So the day started off like any other. Me and my dad got in the car, drove around for a while, and arrived at the farm. I immediately get out of the car and hugged Molly. My parents always got angry when I hugged her since I'd smell like her for the rest of the day. I put her leash on and asked my dad if I could take her for a walk. He always thought that we would just go down to a road and back, but I always found it more interesting to take her to the forest. I always felt like a certain kind of peace and relaxation was there that was unmatched by pretty much anything else. So we took a turn and headed to the forest. Usually when we got there, I'd take her off her leash so that she could explore on her own. Most of the time, I'd carve my name into the trees or look for anything interesting, really. I was playing baseball with some rocks and a wooden leg, presumably from an old table, and then I heard it. Molly was barking at something. This wasn't usual for her when we were in the forest, too. I thought that it was a fox or some other animal, so I quickly grabbed the wooden leg like a weapon. I knew that if it was a fox, I wouldn't attack it, but I had a sense of security while I was holding it anyway. I called out Molly a couple of times, but she just kept barking. This was very strange for me, since she always came to me when I called her. I followed the sound of her barks, though, and stumbled across a scene that, honestly, I'll never forget. There was a man, probably in his late 50s, half naked, carrying a large machete in one hand and holding moonshine in the other. This was the first time that I stumbled across someone in the woods, let alone someone half naked and carrying a big-ass machete. He was completely ignoring Molly and hacking away at the ground for some reason. I didn't really know how to handle the situation, if I'm being honest. Even now, I have no idea how I would handle it. But I asked, in confusion, "Sir, are you okay?" I don't think I understood the seriousness of the situation at the time, but he turned around, revealing his face. And he had some of the clearest blue eyes that I've ever seen to this day. And I could see them so well because they were completely open wide. He looked at me and said, "Come here, boy, look what I've dug up." I was afraid that if I didn't listen to him that he would start chasing after me, and that was something that I wanted to avoid at all costs. I got closer, but kept a good distance still. I didn't see anything except for an empty hole. He returned to hitting the ground with his machete, occasionally taking sips from the bottle, and I used this window of time to get my dog and start walking away slowly as to not notify him that I was leaving. But then I took one final glance at the man, and his head was dug deep in that hole. I was so intrigued, though, that I just kept watching. I know that this was stupid of me, but I was curious. He finally got up from the ground, and I was shocked when I saw him carrying a bone in his mouth. I have no idea what animal it belonged to, if it even did belong to an animal. I had just seen enough at this point, though, and started sprinting with my dog. As we ran, I heard him laughing, and then I saw something flying from the corner of my eye. It was that damn machete. I heard him yell, "Damn it," and this made me run even faster. I know the forest really well, so I wasn't afraid of getting lost, and I ripped through the branches and the bushes until I got out of the forest, but I didn't stop sprinting until I arrived at the garage where my father was testing out lights on our tractor. And stupidly, I didn't tell him a single thing about the man since I was afraid that he'd get angry and wouldn't allow me to walk Molly anymore. Needless to say, though, I never went back to that forest alone, ever again. From March to May of 2017, I toured Europe with my mum and sister. I was 16 at the time, and we were Australian. I'm the classic stereotypical Aussie teenage girl, blonde, blue or green eyes, tan. I'd say I look pretty average, if it really matters, but yeah. So our trip, of course, happened to collide with all of the attacks, and we drove down to Westminster Bridge the week after the attack, saw all the memorials. We visited other places a month after the machete attacks, and we boarded the subway the day before a bomb was let off on it, and we'd taken the exact same route at the same time. And due to all of this, we were all on very high alert for the entirety of our trip. And I think that explains my behaviour in this story too. So, our trip mostly consisted of us staying in a hotel, an apartment, or lodge for 2 or 3 days, then driving on to the next place. I can't remember where this particular hotel was, and it's important to know that I'm a very big go-with-the-flow person, so I didn't really know where we were. I didn't care if it was an apartment or a hotel, I just knew that on that particular day I was sick, and I decided to stay instead of go out into the freezing cold and get sicker. So my sister and my mum went without me. About 10 minutes after they left, I heard the door open. I'd been watching a movie on my laptop and didn't pay much attention to it. I figured my mum had forgotten something and came back for it, although the time-lapse seemed a little long for that. But it still seemed like the most likely thing, so I didn't think too much of it. But she didn't call out to me, and I wondered if she thought I might be asleep or if it was a maid service. Usually they call out, "Hello, is anybody in there?" when they enter, but maybe they figured that we were already gone. So I waited, getting more and more concerned with every passing minute. I wasn't on high alert, but I already am a very paranoid person by nature. And although I tend to diminish my own paranoia, in the moment all I was thinking is, "Oh my goodness, you're so pathetic. Do you really think a robbery or something would take place with you in your room?" I also, admittedly, succumbed to that paranoia a lot. I figured it was most likely just a landlord, though, if it wasn't a maid service to begin with. Again, I didn't know if we were in a hotel or an apartment complex. So I did what any antisocial, anxiety-ridden, paranoid teenager girl would do, and I hid in the closet. Even at the time, digging myself beneath the bundles of blankets that they shoved in there, I thought I was being ridiculous. So ridiculous, in fact, that I took a Snapchat of myself in the closet with a caption along the lines of, "Is it a robber or the maid service in my room? A day in the life of my name." My friends thought that I was an absolute idiot, and I remember one messaging me and laughing about, "Oh, maybe it's another attack." But I didn't answer her. I was too focused to try and figure out what the hell this person who'd come in was doing. It sounded like they were going from room to room, raiding the place almost, and I heard things being moved around, and not in the way that they would be if someone was trying to clean underneath or something like that. It was just really rough. Anyway, I heard doors open and close again and again. They even came into the room that I was in and rummaged around for a while. I honestly don't know if they looked into a closet. I'd left the door open a bit, enough for them to peer into because it had caught on something and closing it would have caused more noise, but I was hidden beneath the bundles and bundles of thick blankets. I'm a girl of very small stature, so I pretty much wouldn't have been noticed. And finally, it sounded like they left. I say they because, well, I strongly suspect that there were two people. The footsteps and the movements just didn't really match up to one person, but I still thought it was most likely my mum, and I was just paranoid and hallucinating. I waited a good 15 minutes after they left before I climbed out of my hiding spot. I was pretty unnerved, but I came out and checked our suitcases. We had left them open in the living room, bearing our money and passports for all to see, and pretty much nothing looked disturbed. That is, except the passports maybe, I think. My mum keeps all our passports in a Ziploc bag. The Ziploc bag had been opened, and 2 passports had been pulled out. One was half in the Ziploc bag, like they'd opened it enough to check whose it was, and then ignored it. The second was left on the top of the clothes, which meant that someone had picked it up and looked through it. I opened it, and it was my one. My mother came home several hours later, and I asked her if she'd come back about 10 minutes after leaving, if she'd come back to get something that she'd forgot. And she just looked perplexed and said no. And I was honestly pretty shocked by this. I asked if we were in a hotel with a maid service or if she'd called a maintenance man to come by and forgotten to tell me. She started looking suspicious and then said no and asked me why. I asked her if we had a landlord that might have come by and she said no. And then it hit me in that moment that an honest-to-God stranger had been in my hotel room while I was still in there hiding. Still, I didn't feel like making it a big deal. Maybe they gave someone the wrong keycard and they didn't realize until they went through my room and looked through our passports to see who was staying in the room or something. I mean, after all, nothing had been taken. So I decided to go with my mother for the rest of the day, and still unnerved about the experience, we were in the town chatting with some locals who asked where we were staying. We told them, and they just looked horrified. I wasn't there for the conversation, but according to my mother, they told her, "I don't want to frighten you, but I think you should leave that place immediately. We here have a suspicion that they're trafficking girls from there, and a lot of backpackers go missing after visiting there." Well, we left that day, and my mother didn't tell me the reason until we were in the car. For someone to have gotten into my room, they would have needed to be allowed into the main doors by an employee, or have a keycard themselves to have access. Then they would have needed to have had my keycard to my room. And I also suspect that maybe someone was watching on the CCTV cameras and saw my mum and sister leave and realized that I wasn't with them. It gives me chills to think about it, but it's never really kind of just hit me, considering even in the moment that I kept thinking that I was the biggest idiot in the world for hiding in a closet because I was scared of socializing with a maid service. But I think that the fact that I kept thinking that I was so dumb and paranoid and dramatic for all of it throughout the experience might have just saved my butt. It meant that I kept a level head and listened for clues, that I didn't have adrenaline pumping through my veins and clouding my thoughts, and honestly, I think that I was pretty lucky. Years ago, when I was about 13 or 14 years old, I went on a trip to celebrate Easter with my mum's family. It was a tradition for us to have a picnic in the middle of a big field about 40 minutes from my grandma's house. This field is basically in the middle of nowhere in rural Mexico. That day, my cousins and I got really curious about a small hill that we could see from the field. It always caught our attention because it looks like a giant took a big bite out of it or something. It used to work as a rock mine several years ago. But anyway, we decided to go investigate, so we left the picnic, walked for about 20 minutes until we crossed a road and went up the hill. Once we were there, we started looking for a way to trespass a metallic fence that kept us from going into the actual mine, and eventually we found a hole in it. My cousin was recording with a cell phone as we were making jokes and acting like normal cringy teenagers when suddenly she just froze and whispered, "Hey, there's something in the rocks." And she pointed her camera to the rock wall behind us. At first I thought that she was joking, but something about her expression just seemed off, so I turned back and there was a human dog-like hybrid looking at us from the hole in the rocks, about 20 or 30 meters above the ground. It had pink and pale and wrinkly skin and a long snout, long ears, wide eyes, and hands with long fingers. It had no hair and it kept still, just watching us. After what felt like an eternity, the weird creature finally went into the hole again and we started running back to the picnic spot. We showed the video to our family right after being scolded for going so far without saying anything to anyone, but you could barely see anything on the video. After all these years, I still don't know what that thing was, and I still get goosebumps when I think about it. The mother of my best friend had a brother working in the mine in the 70s or so, and she claims that he and other workers died there, but the families never got the bodies back. Apparently, too, rocks collapsed multiple times, killing people working there and made it really difficult to retrieve the corpses. Or that's what the owners of the mine said to all the families involved anyway. And after a few incidences, they just decided to close the mine for good. I think that throughout my life, I've had my fair amount of bad meetups with people. I believe that it's probably my fault in most cases because, well, I try to be polite and kind and don't realize that such a behavior could turn out with bad results in the future. But one time I thought that there was nothing that I could do. I was trying to pass the exams for the Fine Arts University, and in order to get in, which is extremely hard, people have been taking these exams from 5 to 10 years on average to pass. You had to have some basic knowledge of drawing technique with charcoal and colours, as well as be good in composition and other stuff regarding your art. So, in order to get good enough to pass, you essentially have to go to drawing prep schools specifically created for these exams. Most of them, if not all, were too far away from my hometown, so my father thought to send me to a German artist who has done commissions for him, living in a small town away from our own. He was around 60 and really good at his work, but because the distance was still too big, I had to go and live at this town, and he would privately tutor me. We would have courses for 4 to 6 hours a day, every day at the house that I was living, and at first it all seemed well and good. But since I knew what was needed for the exams, I was asking him to focus on charcoal and composition, but instead he was teaching me random things which were pretty much not relevant with my exams. These kinds of things needed lots of materials too, other than paint, like construction composition. He would leave to grab the materials on a regular basis, but when he would come back, I would notice that he was always actually drunk, reeking of beer. I immediately realized then that this was pretty much leading nowhere, and I just wanted to try and persuade him to do what I was in need of for my exams. At first, everything seemed nice and normal except the issues mentioned above, but as time started passing, I started meeting people, including a neighbor next door who was a Marine cop, and the 2 friends that I've made at the time noticed too that his car was moving in town and that he was drinking in his parked car many times. At the time, I just thought that it was something that I couldn't poke my nose into and silently just tried to let it slide. But gradually, he became more intense. He would be drunk and start telling me about his life and touch my shoulders and just be too close to me physically when I was drawing. I was trying to keep a distance and still talking to him in plural. It's pronounced out of respect here, but he would just lean closer and closer. At one point, my friends took notice of something really strange too. Wherever I was going, his car would be parked just a few blocks away from where we were, every single time. Since it was a small town with only one main street at the beach, I reassured them though that this was probably just a coincidence. But then, one night, I woke up from the barks of the 2 stray dogs that I've adopted while I was there. I woke up and went to check what was wrong, and I saw his car parked across the street in front of my house. Since it was too dark, I couldn't see if he was in there or not, but I certainly got pretty freaked out. I tried to calm down my thinking that he was probably at one of the bars, which were really close to my house, just drinking. Note too that the house that I was living in was not on any floor, and that the enclosure on my small yard was more of a decoration rather than practical, and that the house was on the main road at the beach, but a little further away than the actual town. So at this point, I started to become more alarmed about him, and he gradually started to become more intimidating as well. Because I've been a victim of harassment before, for 6 years, and my mother and stepdad accused me of being an attention whore and didn't want to believe me, until I was sent to the hospital with grave wounds after a rough night, I've pretty much lost my faith and stopped relying on my family whenever something was happening. I've also to add that the police in my country take these issues way too lightly and most of the times just disregard them as women just trying to get some attention or overreacting. And as a result, I could barely sleep. I was always sleeping in the living room so I could be with my dogs and have better access to the front door's window, which was right next to me. I also started checking out the window with my lights out so that he wouldn't see me. I thought that he wasn't there some nights, but I'm pretty sure that I was wrong. As I started to become more suspicious, I also went through the back balcony and into some fields a couple of times, and his car was always parked in a really close range of my house, just not across from it anymore. I didn't know how to confront him about this whenever we had classes together. I've told the issues to my newly made friends and sometimes would even pass most of the nights with the Marine cop just to feel safe. But they all agreed that if anything happens that I should call them and they would be a witness if the police ever managed to get involved. And then it came to the night that his alcoholism and unstable mentality kicked in. So I woke up to drink some water and I just saw him staring straight through my window. I honestly just panicked and started yelling, "What are you doing here? Get the hell out of my house." I didn't open the door, mind you, but no matter how much I yelled, he kept on staring at me and he just seemed totally wasted. I called my neighbor cop, and when he saw me on the phone, he started banging on the window. I thought that he was going to break it, and my friend came just in time. He put him on the ground and told me that now that we had evidence of trespassing, that he could get him to the police. Needless to say, though, I left after that. Fast forward 1 year later, I came back for summer holidays with a family friend of mine. Turned out also to be a stalker later on, and it was crazy, but that's a story for another time. But, of course, we went to live in that house. I also have to add here, too, that my teacher also used to smoke certain brands of cigarettes, ladder, and that he also used a certain type of lighter called a Zippo. But the next day of our arrival, me and my friend went to the supermarket to fill the fridge. When we came back, as we took off our shoes off on the couch, she looked at me and said, "Hey, did you put these cigarette butts here?" We only smoked tobacco, so I went and checked, and on the floor there were 3 neatly put cigarette butts, a ladder of course, and after that I told her about what happened last year. We went into the room to change after this, and we froze in place because someone had gone through all of our stuff. All of my underwear was placed on the bed, and when I went to pick them up, there was something that honestly looked like semen on each and every one of them. In the wardrobe too, there was a Zippo lighter placed in the middle of one of the shelves. I panicked obviously and tried to call my cop friend, but he was transferred elsewhere. We most certainly locked the house before leaving, so we checked the windows and balcony door, all locked. I recalled, though, that my dad was given a spare key to one of the town's hotel owners. I was also friends with the owner's son, who knew all about what happened last year, and I also recalled that upon the first meeting between my dad, the teacher, and me, he mentioned that if I ever get locked out of the house, that there was a spare key in the hotel. We went to the hotel and asked if anyone has asked for the house's key, and they told us that no one did. We regarded it as one of the windows being either unlocked or that I'd forgotten the door as such. We tried to spend our vacations peacefully, and we kept on taking the car with my friends going to random beaches far away, each day, so that if he were to follow us, that taking notice of him would be easy. We were always surrounded by others too, and my friends also told me that the teacher was indeed an alcoholic and really not pleasant to be around. No one informed their parents, though, because gossip runs faster than the speed of light, and the truth is altered greatly in the process. But the last night, my friend and I decided to spend a peaceful night together, just the two of us, watching movies on laptop and cooking. We got drunk and passed out on the couches. The dogs were adopted by my friends when I left, and I woke up in the middle of the night because of a ticklish feeling. I was still wasted and dehydrated from all the drinking, and my head was spinning, and the guy was on top of me and looked like he was jerking off. Upon realizing it, I panicked but didn't move, pretending my body was sliding off the couch so that I could slip away. After a while, I found the opportunity and slipped through him and ran at the door, went out to the street and started yelling out for help until a car passing the road pulled over and a couple in it came out. When we went back to the home, no one was there, of course, but thankfully my friend was unharmed, still sleeping, and blamed myself for leaving her there and started crying out of relief. Because of my father's prestige and out of fear that he would just criticize me as my mum and stepdad did in the past, I just never went to the police. Fast forward 2 years though, I've passed the exams after doing an actual prep school and by accident met one of my friends back in the day from that town in the metro. We were catching up with each other when he asked me, "So, how did the court go with the teacher?" I was confused and kind of dumbfounded, asking what court. Apparently, my dad went to his house, though, to chat with him and asked him for a commission for his office. He had 2 bathrooms, one small and one big. My father was using the small one for some reason, and while the teacher was making coffee, he helped himself with his needs, and he opened the door, and there was nothing left of the bathroom. No sinks, no shower, nothing. And instead, from floor to ceiling, there were only paintings and sketches of me. And a corner of it, there was a small altar set up there. Many of the sketches were apparently of me doing everyday stuff or naked with kind of sensual erotic poses. He immediately went on and punched him, and then he called the police. My father has a great influence and power in certain areas, and he immediately tried to put him in jail. And then he realized that that was probably the reason why I stopped the courses with him. And he's heard about the incident of that night during my vacation since then, because the couple were locals of the area and came forth to talk to him. He never did ask me anything, though, let alone mention what happened. Because all the cops were his friends, he tried to make sure that he put him in jail, one way or another, quietly. But it was kind of the talk of the town for some time anyway. I felt relief and, if I'm being honest, a bit of shame too that I didn't rely on him due to my past experiences with other family members. And I felt shame too, if I'm being honest, that I never tried to fix the situation because one day he could have harmed someone else if I left it alone. So, I suppose the moral of the story is to rely on others that you can trust. Because, at the end of the day, you could prevent the same things that happen to you, be it a hellish experience or something mundane. I was selfish and a little bit egocentric, only thinking the ifs of reactions, and honestly, I think I did more harm than good. Anyway, that's my story, and thanks for listening. So, some brief background to begin. I, a 23-year-old male at the time, and my brother, 30 years old, had just recently moved into an apartment together. and it was an old 2-story house converted to 2 apartments, upstairs and downstairs, had an attached garage that led onto a downstairs kitchen. Directly next to the door from the kitchen to the garage was the door to our bathroom. So we had lived there maybe 3 months at the time of this occurrence. We had left the house around 7 p.m. on a random autumn night, needing groceries, laundry soap, what have you, and so we buy all of our stuff and make it back to the house. The garage was very narrow, to the point where I had to exit his car before we could pull in so that we could give ourselves more room to get out by getting the passenger side door too close to the wall. So I exit the vehicle, walk into the garage, very poorly lit, mind you, one faded light bulb, up the 4 steps and into the house, groceries in hand. I sit the bags down and immediately head to the bathroom. Bladder was about to burst. Maybe 1 minute has passed from stepping into the house and I hear my brother's car pull in, engine shut off, door open and close, footsteps up the stairs and then silence. Kind of wondering why he hasn't come in the door yet, I finish my business, number 1, and I flush. About the time that I start to push the handle to flush, I hear my brother from the garage say, "So you going to open the door or what?" I walk back around out of the bathroom, open the door to the garage to see him standing there, mouth wide open, face pale as a ghost. He walks in calmly, sets his few bags of groceries down, and proceeds to tell me how he saw me, clearly, fumbling with my keys to try and unlock the door, and as he heard me flush, he blinked, and the other me was just gone. He even explained that he could audibly hear the keys jingling and me grunting trying to unlock the door with bags of groceries in my hands. I'm honestly not sure what the heck that was, but I just wanted to share this in case something similar had happened to someone else. So, I grew up in my teens in a big city, and if it matters, I'm also white and male. While in junior high, I only had a few friends, but was by no means shy or reclusive or anything. Just an average boogerhead, I suppose. While outside on a lunch break, I was walking by the monkey bars. A couple of girls were sitting on the chin-up bars off to the side. As I passed, one of the girls started talking to me. It was normal questions like, "Who are you? What grade? Age? Etc." One of the girls made to spin down or slipped or something, but she was hanging upside down by one knee. She locked her leg in a similar position and turned loose with her hands. Her shirt slid right down over her head and she was fully exposed since her bra didn't fit right. Everyone was laughing and looking, but no one was helping, and no one noticed the issue that I could plainly see. So I grabbed her shirt and pulled it up to cover her, helped her down and walked with her to the building. I figured that it was a good deed done and that would be that. But not quite. So after school, she was waiting for me. And out of nowhere, she gave me a hug and then kissed me on the mouth. I pulled back because I don't know this person and I don't want to get involved. I guess, though, that she was offended and she asked me what was wrong, never been kissed by a black girl. I told her no, but that was not the problem. She asked what the problem was, and I truthfully told her that I didn't remember her name and I didn't know her. She laughed and said that it was Letitia, and then we said goodbye so that I could catch the bus. The following Monday, Letitia is waiting for me at lunch. She tells me that she never did thank me for saving her. I told her not to worry about it. It's cool, and we walked around the soccer field, and then she stops me with her hand and says, "My mum wants to meet you." I ask her why, and she tells me that she told her mum what happened, and now she wants to meet me. She goes on to say that she's picking me up so that you can meet her then. And then we go back to our classes. I was never really academically inclined, so now the whole damn day just will not move along. School ends, and after dragging my butt, I meet Letitia. We walk to the parking lot, and she gets all happy and says, "There's Mum." We walk over, and her mum gets out of the car and gives me a hug. I'm internally losing my crap, but she says how good it is to meet me, how nice I was to have been there for her daughter, and then she says, "You must come home for dinner." I start making excuses about my parents and whatnot, don't like me out after school nights and so, and she says, don't worry, it's all taken care of. I already called your mum. And then she says, dinner tomorrow night at 6. They get in the car and I get on the bus, just kind of scratching my head. As soon as I get home, I say to my mum, why did you say yes? And she replies with that it'll apparently be good for me to meet other people and girls. I had visions of telling her, oh, I've met her all right, seen some stuff too. But in the end, I just kind of accepted it all. The next day just sucks and it takes forever, and at the same time it jerks forward at warp speed at the end. Lunch break truly sucked. Letitia had told everyone that I was going to her house for dinner. Oh, and to meet my dad. I walk back to the building and spend the rest of the school day planning my escape while answering questions about dinner, like what's for dinner. The day ends without me having a plan, and she walks me to the bus since her mum isn't there yet, and then she tries kissing me again. I get home, not saying a word to anyone, and I just go to my room. My mother pops her head in and tells me to change for my date and goes back to what she's doing. She drives me over and says that they'll be bringing me home, and I say, oh no, you come and get me. I don't know these people, and I don't know why I'm going, why I was invited or anything to begin with. You come and get me, Mum, or I'm not going. She agrees and tells Letitia's mother that she'll pick me up, and they agree on a time, and my mum leaves. I meet her 3 brothers, her 2 sisters, a cousin, and a grandmother, and everyone's pretty cool. Well, one brother keeps giving me a stink eye, but there's nothing I can do about that, so I just ignore it. I thought that maybe, just maybe, I could hang out with the 3 brothers, even the one with the stink eye, but that did not happen. I end up sitting next to Grandma, which was cool because Letitia is hovering, and after about 15 minutes of nothing conversation, her dad comes home, and this man is huge. He stands up to me as I stand, thinking about running, to be honest, and he smothers my hand in his. He says, so you're the boy who's seen and rescued my daughter. He asked me a couple of questions that I just nodded or shook my head to. My mind is screaming at me to talk, and he says, take a seat. So I did. He spoke for a while, telling me that interracial relationships were difficult at best. I can feel my neck twisting around to look at Letitia, while he says that at the most you can expect a little hostility. She walks over and sits above me on the arm of the couch. I'm looking at her dad and then her, and kind of over and over again. And then she reaches out and takes my hand. I finally find my words and whisper, what did you tell them? She laughed and said, just that we're girlfriend and boyfriend. I didn't mention the other thing that we did. And at this point, I was like, hell no, you kissed me. Her dad stops talking and is just kind of looking at us. Her grandmother, having sat right there the whole damn time, turns and adjusts her seat on the couch so that she can too look at us. I'm turning red, embarrassed, but also getting pretty angry, and her dad says, what thing? And at that point, I just told him that she kissed me, and it came out as an accusation. He looks at me and then looks at her, and he takes a deep, slow breath and says, well, maybe you two will make it. And I was like, what? And then he said, when the 2 of you are old enough, and if you still want to, I'll give you my blessing. And at this point, I was pretty angry, so I said, blessed for what? And he says that you'll marry my daughter. I'm stunned and I'm having a major brain fart. I snap out of it when she starts sliding down the arm like she's going to land on me. I popped up and I was straight out of that damn door. I'm running and I get home to an empty house. I go to my room and lay on my bed. The phone rings and I go into the kitchen and answer it. It's my neighbor. He asks if I'm okay and I say that I am, and he tells me that my mum is out driving the streets looking for me. She got a call that I had left in a rush and everyone was worried. I said that I was fine and hung up, and I turned on a lamp in the living room to show that someone was home, and I just went to bed. The phone rings again and I return to the kitchen and I answer, and then I hear, you will marry my daughter. It was her dad, and I am not doing this. I'm not doing the phone games again, so I say, "Sir, I wouldn't marry your daughter for all the tea in China." And he says, "You will marry her." I said, "I don't know what she's told you. I don't know if she's crazy or if you are, but I am not, repeat, not marrying her or anyone else. I helped her and she kissed me. I didn't even know her name. We're not dating. We have never dated and we never will." He got quiet for a bit after this, and then he said, "Is what you just said true?" I replied, "Every damn word." And then he tells me to watch out for his sons until he can come collect them. He then hangs up. The brothers then announce themselves with pounding on my front door. I start gearing up with multiple sweaters and 2 pairs of blue jeans. I get my bat ready and walk into the living room. I look out the bay window and they're still there. I look at my dad's gun rack, but don't grab one. I know that they're loaded. I do mentally select the weapon that I will use if anything else goes down, but the banging then stops. I look out the window again, and the neighbour is talking to the brothers. While I'm watching, my mum pulls into the drive, and then their father pulls up. My mum then goes to talk to them, and I can picture her telling them all to come in. After a minute or two, she comes in and says, "Are you okay?" I say back to her, "Mum, was this some kind of joke or a prank? Please say yes." And she walks over and hugs me and says, "No. Son, you did a good thing at school, and don't let this stop you from doing the right thing again." She continued with, "I'm sorry, I had no idea." I went to my room where I just sat there, and I don't even remember what I was thinking. And to this day, almost 40 years later, I just shake my head when this memory returns. I don't know what those brothers were planning to do to me and what she told them, but they were pretty angry and they were looking for any excuse to get me. So I normally get up and ready for work around 4 a.m. and out of the house by 5:30. I had just dropped my daughter off at the babysitter and realised that I forgot to pack my lunch, so I decided to stop at a local Walmart to pick something up. The parking lot was pretty much empty, as was the store because of how early it was. But I went inside, got what I needed, and walked back to my car and got in. On an instinct, I always lock my car doors when I get in. It's just a good habit that I'm in, and I was looking down at my phone, scrolling through, and all of a sudden there's this totally normal-looking guy just standing at my window. I don't know how, but I didn't even see him approach. He startled me, and I immediately put my hand on my hip because I have a pistol there, and he motions for me to roll down my window, so stupidly I do, but only slightly enough that I can hear him. He then asks for a ride, says that his car is broke down and his phone is dead and he just lives right around the corner, which seemed odd because it's like 69 degrees outside. I live in a small town, so it's not a busy road, so, walk? I apologized, though, and informed him that I don't give rides to people that I don't know, but I'd be happy to call him a cab to come and pick him up. He got angry with me and asked again and pulled on my door handle. I said, "Please go, I'm not giving you a ride and you're scaring me." He then looked at me with the nastiest, most disturbing look that I've ever seen on someone's face, and I swear to you that his eyes turned fully black, and then said, "Well, I guess you get to live today." Turned and just walked away. I sat there literally shaking and almost in tears. He scared me so bad. So I immediately drove away and called the police. I never did hear back from them, and I really don't know what happened, but it instilled in me my decision to never give strangers rides. When I was 16, I got a job as a personal assistant, a cleaning lady for a wealthy couple who lived in a big beautiful mansion on Lake Michigan. It was a great job at the time, but after a while I had to quit because of everything going on, and I'm going to tell you exactly what that was. So, I made $12 an hour as a 16-year-old girl, and that was just crazy to me at the time, but now I know that it's because the homeowners couldn't get anyone to stay and work for them. It could very well be because they're both just major dicks, but I honestly didn't see them all that much during the school year, so it was fine. I could work 40 hours a week in the summer and part-time while I was in school. So, during the school year, I would hardly ever see the homeowners and would be left alone to clean the house, mostly. I had a key, alarm code, and gate code, so I let myself in and out. In the summer months, I had help from a few other employees, but in the school year, I didn't. At first, I loved being in the house by myself, don't get me wrong. The place was absolutely gorgeous, right on Lake Michigan, so I'd always open all the curtains to let the sunlight in and blast the surround speakers while I cleaned. It wasn't until I was by myself that I just started noticing how weird the place was. Nothing ever exactly felt welcoming about the place. Sure, it was pretty to look at, but it was modern and everything was hard marble and stone. Not very homey feeling. My first experience happened when I was cleaning one day in the silence. I remember specifically not turning on the music because I had a bad headache that day, when all of a sudden, the speaker to the upstairs part of the house turned on. Now, the way their speaker system works, you can control it by like a touchpad thing in the kitchen, which would play the music everywhere besides the basement and master bedroom. To play music in those areas, you have to go to that touchpad and turn it on by the control pad and sync it up with the rest of the house. The reason this was so alarming was I was the only one there as far as I know. I walked up the stairs to go check out what was going on and figure out why the music was turned on, seemingly by itself. I looked around and called out the homeowner's name, thinking that someone just came in without me noticing or something, but the doors were all still locked and no one was home. I shut off the music and went back downstairs, not thinking too much of it because it could have just been a malfunction of some sort, but it started happening more often after this. I'd be listening to music and it would just turn off, or it would be off and would turn on in a completely different area of the house or something. I brushed it off as faulty just again and again and didn't think too much of it. But the second and definitely most prevalent story I remember from working there was when I was cleaning the workout room in their basement. I never wanted to go in this room, and to be honest, I really couldn't tell you why. It was just something about this room that was weird. It was super cold and dark, and I just felt really anxious in that room. I definitely tried to avoid it, but my boss would get mad when dust would build up, so I forced myself to go in there once a week to tidy up and whatnot. So, anyway, I was in the workout room using a broom and a mop. I remember sweeping up the floor and propping the broom against a machine while I was using the mop, when suddenly the broom just fell over, hitting the wall, the baseboard, and the floor as it fell, causing 3 distinct knocks. And what I heard after that scared me so badly that I refused to go into that room by myself ever again. Immediately following the knocks made by the broom falling, 3 knocks responded in the exact same pattern the broom fell. But it was coming from inside of the wall. I know what you're thinking, but no, it was not an echo. It was not a scared animal. It was definitely knocking, deliberate knocking. I was completely alone in a big quiet house in the middle of nowhere, and someone is knocking back at me from inside the wall? To this day, I have absolutely no explanation for what I experienced that day. Lastly, too, this is the first and only time I've ever seen anything paranormal with my own 2 eyes, and I know this time it's not me being paranoid or crazy because I was with a coworker who saw it too. So sometimes my boss would rent out her guest room and we would clean it before the guests arrived. And this guest house has a glass hallway leading from one main area of the house to another. So I was cleaning the glass while one of my co-workers, Bob, was standing next to me talking. And just then I catch a glimpse of what looked like a boy in a blue shirt running by. I turned my head just as Bob turned his head as well, and he asked me if I saw that too. And I said yes. Like I said, I eventually did quit this job because there were just too many weird things happening in that place for me to be there and feel safe. So, a year ago, my apartment complex decided that they wanted to renovate my unit, so I had to move out at the end of my lease. I live in Denver, and rent is pretty ridiculous here, so I started worrying about finding something affordable in my neighborhood, which I love. I posted on the Nextdoor app to see if anyone in my neighborhood knew of any affordable rentals in the area, and I immediately got a message from someone named Joe who said that one of the condos in his complex was going to be up for rent soon and he knew the owner. He offered to get me in touch with the owner, and I asked if he could send me pictures of the unit, and he asked if he could text me some pictures his neighborhood took because that chat function on the app is really slow. I now feel stupid for doing this, but I gave him my phone number, and I kid you not, I received a phone call from an unknown number within seconds. I normally don't answer calls from unknown numbers, but I was expecting a call from a number that wasn't saved in my phone anyway, so I answered it. But I was completely bewildered when the person said, "Hi, it's Joe. How's your day going?" It honestly took me by surprise, and I just didn't know what to say. He started to shoot the breeze on the phone with me, talking about how he works nights and how tired he is and how he takes care of his daughter while his girlfriend works during the day, and I finally interrupted and said, "So, about that condo?" And he just pretty much disregarded that and said, "I don't think my girlfriend would appreciate me talking to you, but I don't have to tell her, right?" At this point, I said that I have to go, and I just immediately hung up the phone. As soon as I did, he started texting me, though. It was just really bizarre and kind of alarming to me, I must admit, and I just blocked his number, but moments later, he found me on Facebook and sent me a friend request. Now, I'm 32 years old, but it was so disturbing to me that I called my parents to tell them about it and how unnerved it made me. And the worst part is that on Nextdoor, even if your exact address isn't listed, your complex is. I was pretty certain that I didn't have my address visible on my profile, but I checked and sure enough, my address and unit number were public. Unable to contact me any other way, he started messaging me again on Nextdoor, asking if I wanted to go on a walk with him. You can't block or report people on this app, so I eventually just deleted it. But one night, a month or so later, I had a knock at my door around 10 on a weeknight. I looked out my peephole, but couldn't get a good enough look at the person. He had his head down slightly, but either way, I don't answer the door for anyone that I'm not expecting, especially not a random guy at 10 o'clock at night. Feeling panicked, though, I call my neighbor across the hall. She's an older woman, and we look out for each other since we both live alone. I ask her if it looked like he was a delivery guy at the wrong door or something. She opened her door to get a good look at the guy, and that spooked him because he just literally ran away. Now, I have no idea if this was the next door guy or not, but my gut tells me that it probably was. This was a big wake-up call, though. I always felt like I practiced good online safety, but I didn't even know my address was visible on Nextdoor. I'll never be casual or lazy about privacy settings like that again, that's for sure. But for now, I have to deal with the fact that this creepy guy knows where I live, and allegedly is showing up to my house late at night.